Deep in the dense canopy of the Guatemalan jungle, a massive block of limestone sits unfinished. The chisel marks are still sharp, biting deeply into the pale rock. It is a monument meant to record the long count calendar, but the final glyphs are missing. The sculptor simply stopped working. There are no signs of a struggle around the quarry site, no ash layer from a sudden fire. The tools were set down, and the hands that held them never returned to finish the sentence. This stone does not mark a gradual decline. It marks the exact moment a deeply complex, mathematically advanced society exhaled its final breath. We often think of history as a slow, inevitable fade from one era to the next. We imagine great empires crumbling over centuries, their citizens gradually adapting to a new way of life. But the physical evidence left in the dirt tells a much more abrupt story. Across the globe, the archaeological record is littered with sudden interruptions. We find hearths with meals left unconsumed in the Mediterranean. We find massive defensive wooden palisades in North America abandoned halfway through construction. We find standardized mud bricks stacked neatly in the squares of the Indus Valley, waiting for masons who vanished thousands of years ago. These are the interrupted civilizations. They did not transition softly into the history books. They simply stopped. It is a profound historical anomaly that requires a certain stillness to fully examine. As we begin this forensic journey across the continents, I invite you to settle in. Wherever you find yourself tonight, and whatever time it might be, consider leaving a quiet like on this exploration as we piece together the scattered fragments of the past. Your presence here is the tether that connects our modern, highly engineered world to those who left no forwarding address. We will need that connection. The scale of the systemic collapse we are about to uncover is deeply unsettling. The half-carved stone in the jungle is not an isolated incident of local misfortune. It is a striking symptom of a civilizational failure that has repeated itself across every major landmass. When we look closely at the deepest layers of the earth, a terrifying pattern emerges. Peak human ingenuity is almost always followed by a sudden absolute silence. Societies engineer continent-spanning water systems. They map the stars with flawless precision and build metropolises housing hundreds of thousands of citizens. Then, the archaeological record simply cuts to black. There are rarely letters of surrender or treaties of defeat. There are rarely mass graves explaining a sudden exodus. There is only the encroaching forest, the drifting desert sand, or the rising sea. For centuries, these vanishings were relegated to the realm of myth, folklore, and cautionary tales. Early explorers assumed these immense cities were swallowed by divine retribution. But modern forensic science has begun to pierce the canopy, the soil, and the glacial ice. Through microscopic analysis of fossilized pollen, isotopic signatures in stalagmites, and ancient tree rings, the Earth is finally yielding its raw data. We are no longer relying on legends. We are reading the environmental autopsy reports of entire empires. We can track the exact decade the rain stopped falling, or the year the ocean swallowed the coast. We can measure the desperation of a civilization through the deteriorating quality of a single copper coin. The question is no longer whether these thriving societies collapsed. The evidence of their ruin is etched into the very stones they left behind. The question is, what invisible, systemic force made millions of people drop their tools mid-strike and walk away into the dark? The chisel resting beside the limestone block did not fall because of a curse. To understand why a thriving society simply stops breathing, we must abandon the comfort of folklore. We turn instead to the quiet, unyielding testimony of the earth itself. This investigation relies on the meticulous process of an environmental autopsy. We are not searching for myths, but for the microscopic fingerprints of disaster left behind by interrupted civilizations. The answers are frozen in the ice, buried in the silt of ancient lakes, and calcified in the rings of dead trees. Consider the precise tools of this modern investigation. Climatologists extract vast cylinders of ice from the polar caps, drilling down through 3,000 meters of compacted snow. Each unbroken core represents a frozen timeline spanning hundreds of thousands of years. By analyzing the trapped gas bubbles and isotopic signatures within, researchers read a ledger of the ancient atmosphere. They can pinpoint the exact decade a global temperature plummeted. Botanists perform a similar magic in the mud. By extracting sediment cores from the bottoms of forgotten lakes, they isolate fossilized pollen grains to track the sudden death of a harvest. A sharp drop in agricultural pollen replaced immediately by wild weeds, provides an undeniable timeline of starvation. From the sky, modern technology strips away the camouflage of time. Light detection and ranging equipment allows researchers to fire billions of laser pulses through the suffocating density of the jungle canopy. The returning signals map the topography of the forest floor with devastating accuracy. This reveals the true scale of the ruins below. It allows us to trace the foundations of thousands of homes previously hidden by the trees. What these precise measurements reveal is a terrifying paradox. We naturally assume that extreme civilizational complexity guarantees survival against the elements. The forensic data proves the exact opposite. Extreme complexity breeds extreme vulnerability. A small nomadic tribe can simply walk away when the local river dries up. They pack their tools and follow the retreating water to a new horizon. An empire cannot walk away. A sprawling metropolis, burdened with rigid infrastructure and millions of dependent citizens, becomes a magnificent trap. When an advanced society masters its environment through massive engineering, it simultaneously builds an architecture of supreme fragility. Every towering aqueduct and centralized granary represents a vital artery. Systemic civilizational collapse occurs when compound environmental pressures strike a society that has reached its absolute carrying capacity. A severe drought might weaken the harvest, sparking internal rebellion, which in turn leaves the borders undefended. It is a compounding fracture of interconnected systems failing all at once. Over the course of our journey, we will examine these fatal fractures across the globe. We will look at the precise moments when the architecture of survival broke down, leaving nothing but silent monuments behind. From the frozen fjords of the far north to the dense, humid jungles of the equator, the forensic evidence tells a remarkably consistent story. To read this story accurately, we require a disciplined method. We must establish a strict forensic framework to examine these disappearances without falling into the trap of easy assumptions. Every ruin we visit will be measured against a rigorous sequence of evidence. Consider a single, cracked clay amphora resting in the dune sea of North Africa. It lies half buried within the stone foundations of a 3rd century Roman frontier fort. This quiet ruin is our proving ground. 2,000 years ago, this was a bustling node on the edge of an empire. It was an outpost built to project permanent, unyielding power. Soldiers here managed vast grain stores and carved daily records into wooden tablets. Then the gates were simply left open. No walls were breached by invading armies. The desert moved in and swallowed the barracks. To understand how complex societies vanish, we cannot rely on myths. We must build a rigid forensic framework. We will use a 4-step ladder of evidence to examine these interrupted civilizations. The first step of our ladder is the accepted historical reading. For decades, traditional scholars assumed the Roman garrison simply retreated. They believed political instability back in the capital forced the military to abandon the edges of the map. It is a neat, human-centric explanation. It flatters our belief that empires fall solely because of human decisions. But the physical ruins refuse to cooperate with this story. This leads to the second step of our ladder. We must ask what the accepted reading fails to explain. If this was a coordinated strategic retreat ordered by a general, the soldiers would have packed up. They would have dismantled their heavy grain mills and taken their valuable bronze tools. Instead, modern archaeologists found heavy equipment left perfectly in place. The departure was not a planned military maneuver, but a desperate, immediate evacuation. The third step introduces the stronger alternative, driven by our modern environmental autopsy. Science allows us to look past the stone and into the soil itself. Sediment analysis and fossilized plant remains reveal a sudden, localized climate shift. A severe multi-year drought struck the region in the late 3rd century. The underground aquifers that fed the outpost simply dried up. It was not a political choice but a biological mandate. This is the sobering reality of environmental determinism. It is the absolute rule that human ingenuity remains entirely subordinate to the natural world. No amount of Roman engineering or military discipline can defeat a dead well. When the water vanished, the local system broke. The soldiers did not march away on orders from an emperor. They fled because the land could no longer sustain their bodies. Finally, the 4th step of our ladder establishes the explicit limit of our knowledge. Science can tell us exactly why the fort was abandoned. However, it cannot tell us the final fate of those who walked away. We do not know if the retreating soldiers survived the brutal march north to the coast. We do not know if the shifting dunes claimed them before they reached safety. The hard data stops at the edge of the dry well. This four-step method will be our continuous guide. We will look at the accepted story, identify the physical anomalies, and apply modern environmental science. Then we will respect the boundary of the unknown. It is easy to look at a small desert outpost and understand its vulnerability. A fort in the sand is inherently fragile, but the rules of environmental determinism apply to massive, complex empires just as ruthlessly. The mechanism of collapse is rarely a sudden, dramatic battle. It is almost always a shift in the delicate balance of the environment. A few degrees of temperature or a few missing inches of rainfall can erase centuries of progress. We have seen how a hot, shifting desert can quietly erase a stone fortress. The sand is a highly efficient custodian of forgotten things. But the cold can be just as thorough. From the burning dunes of North Africa, we must turn our attention to the absolute edge of human endurance. We leave the suffocating heat behind. We are moving into the freezing dark. Let the desert sands of that forgotten Roman outpost fall away, swept into the deep currents of time. We are moving north, far beyond the reach of any Mediterranean empire, into the biting, salt-heavy winds of the Arctic Circle. Picture a small, heavy object held delicately in the palm of a hand. It is a crucifix barely 4 inches long, yet carrying the immense weight of a civilization. The material is dense, creamy, and polished to a soft, luminous sheen by generations of human touch. It is not carved from oak, nor is it cast in bronze or gold. It is sculpted entirely from the thick, curved tusk of an Atlantic walrus. This single piece of devotion, etched with agonizing precision, tells a profound story of geographical defiance. It was crafted in the late 13th century, a masterwork of medieval art. It was found on the frozen, jagged edge of the known world, in a place the Norse simply called the Eastern Settlement. To the modern mind, Greenland conjures immediate images of uninhabitable ice sheets and desolate frozen fjords. But history is dictated by the shifting moods of the Earth. During the climatic anomaly known as the medieval warm period, the North Atlantic offered a brief, forgiving window. The Norse did not arrive on these shores as mindless raiders seeking plunder. They arrived as determined farmers, skilled navigators, and exceptionally shrewd merchants. When Eric the Red led his fleet to these fjords in the late 10th century, he found deep valleys carpeted in thick, vibrant summer grass. The settlers brought cattle, sheep, and goats across the treacherous ocean in open wooden boats. They built sprawling farmsteads out of heavy stone and thick turf, engineering deep insulation against the inevitable dark winters. But subsistence farming alone could not sustain a complex European society at the edge of the ice. They needed currency to connect them to the mainland. They found it in the freezing, dangerous waters of Disco Bay, located hundreds of miles north of their lush summer pastures. Walrus ivory was the undisputed white gold of the Middle Ages. The traditional supply of elephant ivory from the south had been effectively cut off by geopolitical shifts across the Mediterranean basin. The elite artisans of Europe were desperate for the dense, highly carvable tusks of the Arctic walrus. The Greenland Norse recognized this demand and established a virtual monopoly on this highly prized material. The men would sail north in the treacherous spring months, hunting massive, aggressive marine mammals in waters choked with crushing sea ice. They harvested the tusks, hauled them back south, and traded them to visiting Norwegian merchants. Through this grueling trade, the eastern and western settlements of Greenland grew staggeringly wealthy. They built a thriving economic empire on a foundation of ice and bone. They did not live in primitive, desperate hovels. They used their ivory wealth to import iron tools, vital timber, stained glass, and the finest European fashions. At their absolute peak in the early 14th century, the Greenland Norse numbered around 3,000 people. They constructed over 400 highly organized farms across the two main settlements. They built a fully functioning, rigidly structured medieval society, operating completely isolated from the European continent. The unquestioned crown jewel of this society was the magnificent cathedral at Gardar. It was a massive, imposing stone structure built with red sandstone blocks weighing several tons each. It boasted a traditional cruciform shape, imported glass windows, and a dedicated bishop sent directly from the Pope. Imagine the sheer acoustic power of heavy bronze church bells ringing out across a deep subarctic fjord. Picture the Bishop of Gardar, dressed in fine woolen robes and a golden ring, overseeing a massive feast. The Norse elites drank imported wine and dined on prime beef, surrounded by the towering ancient glaciers of the Greenland ice sheet. This was a civilization operating at the very pinnacle of its capacity. They had successfully transplanted the extreme complexity of medieval European culture into one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. They maintained this fragile, astonishingly successful balance for nearly 500 years. They were a people of deep faith, immense physical resilience, and sophisticated economic integration. Their carved walrus ivory decorated the grandest cathedrals and palaces in the Old World. But extreme societal complexity often acts as a mask for extreme systemic vulnerability. The Greenland Norse were entirely dependent on a delicate, invisible web of international trade, stable climate patterns, and highly specific resource availability. It was a prosperous society balanced blindly on the edge of a knife. Soon, the global climate would begin to shift, and the forgiving window of warmth would slam shut. The sea ice would begin to creep further south with each passing year, and the ringing bronze bells of the Garda Cathedral would soon face an impending absolute silence. The ringing of the bronze bells at the cathedral at Garda once echoed across the deep fjords. The rhythmic chipping of walrus ivory filled the surrounding workshops. These were the sounds of a European outpost successfully clinging to the edge of the ice. Then, the noise stops. It is not a slow, documented fade into obscurity recorded by returning merchants. It is an abrupt and total archaeological silence. Modern researchers excavating the permafrost expected to find the final, tragic chapters of these settlements written directly in the soil. They carefully mapped the graves in the churchyards, looking for the end of the story. The earliest burials were deep, orderly, and respectful. As time progressed, the graves grew shallower. The frost was hardening earlier in the year, making the earth increasingly difficult to dig. But then, the timeline simply breaks. The burials stop completely. There are no mass graves waiting beneath the topsoil. There is no plague pit indicating a sudden, catastrophic epidemic that wiped out the population. In a society so deeply tethered to its religious rites, the dead were always buried in consecrated ground. Even in the harshest winters, bodies were carefully stored in frozen outbuildings until the spring thaw allowed for proper interment. Yet the final generation left no corpses behind. The churchyard at Garda is mysteriously empty of its last parishioners. The biological record simply vanishes, but the physical world they built remains stubbornly rooted in place. Move away from the church, up the steep, wind-swept slopes of the fjords to the individual farmhouses. The heavy stone foundations still sit firmly against the Arctic wind. The architecture is entirely intact. These were not fragile, temporary shelters. They were massive, turf-lined fortresses, specifically engineered to withstand months of total darkness and sub-zero temperatures. The walls were several feet thick, built to harbour large families and their livestock through the endless winter storms. Inside these ruins, the scene is forensically unsettling. Loom weights sit in perfect straight rows on the compacted dirt floors. They rest exactly where the wooden looms slowly decayed above them over the centuries. Iron tools, which were incredibly precious and rare in a land without accessible iron ore, lie abandoned on workbenches. A smoothing iron sits near a collapsed sleeping bench. A whetstone rests beside a half-sharpened blade. The heavy iron cooking pots remain sitting by the cold hearths. The doors were not broken down. There is no ash layer to suggest a violent raid from indigenous groups or European pirates. There are no splintered arrows or broken swords scattered in the dirt. The farmhouses were simply closed up. The inhabitants seemingly set down their tools, stepped out into the freezing wind, and never returned. Consider the sheer, oppressive isolation of this specific geography. The settlements were separated from the European mainland by a brutal freezing ocean. A single supply ship from Norway took weeks, navigating treacherous, iceberg-choked waters, and many never arrived at all. By the early 15th century, those ships had stopped coming entirely. The Greenland Norse were completely cut off from the known world. They were trapped in a shrinking pocket of habitability. To the north lay an advancing, impenetrable ice sheet. To the south lay an empty, lethal ocean. There was no neighbouring town to walk to, and no safe harbour to seek refuge in. The middens, the ancient trash heaps layered outside the farmhouse doors, reveal one final grim forensic detail. The topmost layers of bone tell a story of quiet, escalating desperation as the climate shifted. The bones of hunting dogs bear the distinct cut marks of butchery. These were animals absolutely essential for survival, herding and tracking in the deep snow. In the end, the Norse ate their dogs. They slaughtered their newborn calves before the animals could ever yield milk. Yet even after being pushed to the absolute brink of starvation, consuming their most valuable survival assets, they did not die inside these walls. The archaeological record yields no skeletons huddled around the dead hearths. There are no bodies resting in the sleeping quarters. They left their homes standing, and they left their most prized possessions behind. A thriving society does not simply walk into the ice. A deeply rooted farming culture does not abandon its ancestral lands, its heavy iron tools and its consecrated churches without a catastrophic, undeniable push. The physical structures remain today, silent and waiting against the creeping frost. What invisible, overwhelming force could scrub an entire sprawling settlement of its people, leaving their heavy stone homes entirely unscarred? To understand an empty room, we first look to the sky. The most immediate suspect for the silencing of the Greenland Norse is the weather itself. The climate simply turned against them. For decades, historians blamed a prolonged climatic event known as the Little Ice Age. The evidence is written clearly in the frozen archives of the North. Looking back at the ice core climatology we examined earlier, the temperature record shows a sharp, undeniable plunge. Beginning in the early 14th century, the world began to freeze. The mild, forgiving summers of the medieval warm period vanished entirely. Glaciers advanced down the mountainsides, physically swallowing the vital highland pastures. Sea ice choked the deep fjords, sealing off the shipping lanes and isolating the settlements from the European mainland for years at a time. The Norse were, at their foundation, European pastoralists. Their entire society was built on the grazing of sheep, goats, and cattle. As the winters grew longer and the ground remained frozen deeper into the spring, the annual hay yields plummeted. The carrying capacity of the land simply collapsed beneath them. This is the first step on our evidence ladder. It is the widely accepted forensic reading of the event. The earth cooled, the grass died, the livestock perished, and the people starved. It is a clean, elemental explanation. But this straightforward narrative has a fatal flaw. It fails to explain a glaring anomaly in the historical record. The temperature drop alone does not equal extinction, because the Norse were not the only humans living on this frozen landmass. As the deep cold advanced southward, so did the Thule people. These indigenous hunters, the direct ancestors of the modern Inuit, moved into the very same freezing environments where the Norse were struggling. Yet the Thule did not starve. They expanded and thrived. The difference was entirely a matter of adaptation. The Thule hunted ringed seals through the thick winter ice, using specialized toggling harpoons. They navigated the treacherous, ice-choked waters in flexible, waterproof skin boats. They heated their homes by burning rich marine mammal blubber. The Norse adopted almost none of this vital technology. The archaeological record reveals a staggering, fatal display of cultural rigidity. Over 4 centuries of sharing the same harsh geography, there is virtually no physical evidence of the Norse integrating the survival techniques of their indigenous neighbours. Instead, they stubbornly refused to abandon their European identity. They continued to weave heavy, damp wool clothing, rather than adopting the highly insulated, tailored animal skins worn by the Thule. They obsessively tried to maintain grazing livestock in a landscape that now demanded harpoons and ice fishing gear. They clung to the traditional ways of their ancestors, even as those ways became a slow, creeping death sentence. This profound cultural stubbornness brings us back to the desperate debris left behind in their trash heaps. Consider again those butchered hunting dogs we uncovered in the Middens. Those shattered bones tell a story of profound, self-imposed limitation. A hunting dog is a vital tool, a means of securing future food. To slaughter and eat it is to consume your own capacity to survive tomorrow. They chose to eat their dogs, their newborn calves, and their final stores of seed grain. They did this rather than learn to hunt the abundant marine life thriving just beneath the ice, a skill mastered by the people living only a few valleys away. The plunging temperatures of the Little Ice Age did not kill the Greenland Norse on their own. Their rigid adherence to an incompatible way of life made them fatally vulnerable to the cold. They were trapped not just by the encroaching glaciers, but by the walls of their own culture. Yet cultural pride alone rarely causes a civilization to walk willingly into starvation. A complex society does not simply choose collapse unless another deeper systemic pressure is forcing their hand. To find that pressure, we must look beyond the failing pastures. Let us look again at that polished walrus ivory crucifix. It is not merely an object of devotion, but the very lifeblood of an entire civilization. The stronger alternative to the simple freezing hypothesis suggests the Greenland Norse were victims of a profound systemic economic collapse. They did not just succumb to the cold, they went bankrupt. For over 300 years, this remote outpost operated as a highly specialized cog in a vast transatlantic trade machine. Their survival was entirely subsidized by the European elite. The Norse hunted walruses on the perilous northern ice, extracting the tusks to be carved into luxury chess pieces and cathedral ornaments across the continent. In exchange, Norwegian merchant ships brought the iron, timber and grain that the fragile Greenland ecosystem could not provide. But economies, like climates, are subject to sudden, devastating shifts. During the 14th century, new overland trade networks began to open across the globe. African elephant ivory, vastly superior in size, quality and ease of carving, began flooding into European markets. The European demand for the smaller, brittle walrus tusk plummeted almost overnight. The Norse suddenly found themselves holding a worthless currency at the edge of the known world. As the advancing ice thickened the Atlantic waters, the perilous journey to Greenland became increasingly dangerous. When the ivory lost its value, the risk was no longer justified for European merchants. The vital trade ships simply stopped coming. This economic isolation compounded a quiet, creeping environmental disaster of their own making. The Norse had imported a European agricultural model, specifically sheep and cattle, to a fragile subarctic landscape. For generations, these grazing animals systematically stripped the thin, slow-growing native grasses. Without deep roots to anchor it, the topsoil was left entirely exposed to the brutal freezing winds. Catastrophic soil erosion followed, and the land simply blew away. The Norse were trapped in a tightening vice, unable to trade for foreign grain and suddenly unable to raise their own livestock on the dying pastures. It was a fatal intersection of global market irrelevance and local ecological exhaustion. We can trace this collapse through the shrinking size of the cattle bones in their middens and the shifting isotopes in their own teeth. The forensic evidence paints a meticulous picture of a society slowly starving as its systems failed. But here, we reach the explicit limit of our modern historical record. Science can provide the mechanism of their downfall, but it cannot show us their final moments. We have absolutely no written account of how the end truly arrived. There is no final, desperate letter preserved in the frost. No runestone stands in the ruined churchyards detailing a mass exodus or a final plague. Did the last survivors quietly starve in their stone longhouses as the winter storms howled outside? Did they attempt to board small, decaying boats in a futile, desperate voyage back toward Iceland, only to be swallowed by the freezing Atlantic? The archaeological record offers only an eerie, uninterrupted silence. We can measure the advancing ice in the deep cores, and we can read the shifting market values in dusty European ledgers. But the actual human extinguishing of the Greenland Norse remains a permanent void. They simply vanished into the white. There is a ruin standing on a quiet, grassy slope in southern Greenland. It is the Valsey Church, built from heavy, carefully fitted stones of local granite. The walls are thick, designed to withstand the brutal winds that sweep off the nearby fjord. It is here that the final, definitive chapter of the Greenland Norse was written. On September the 16th, in the year 1408, a wedding took place within these walls. A visiting ship captain named Thorstein Olafsson married a local woman named Sigrid Bjornsdotter. It is the absolute last written record of this society that history possesses. The document, which eventually made its way back across the ocean to Iceland, is perfectly mundane. It details the reading of the banns, the presence of witnesses, and the legal binding of two families. Yet the context surrounding this ordinary event is profoundly haunting. By the early 15th century, the world outside the church doors was rapidly closing in. The Little Ice Age had tightened its grip on the landscape. The congregation gathered in that freezing stone nave would have been a shadow of the settlement's former population. Their clothing was likely patched and threadbare, woven from the wool of the few remaining sheep that could survive the extended winters. Their faces would have carried the physical toll of a diet now desperately dependent on seals. A wedding is inherently an act of optimism. It is a promise made to the future, an assumption that there will be a tomorrow for the next generation. But the community celebrating Thorstein and Sigrid was already marooned at the edge of the known world. The trading ships from Europe had practically stopped coming. The walrus ivory trade, once the economic engine of their society, was entirely dead. The Norse were holding on to their rigid cultural identity, observing the rites of Rome in a landscape that was actively rejecting them. After the ink dried on the letters documenting this marriage, the written history of Norse Greenland simply stops. There are no frantic pleas for help preserved in the archives. There is no final diary entry detailing a sudden invasion or a devastating plague. The silence that follows the year 1408 is absolute. When colonial expeditions finally reached the fjords centuries later to check on the descendants of Eric the Red, they found nothing but empty buildings. The farmhouses were intact, the church walls stood firm, but the people were entirely gone. The forensic evidence left behind in the soil points not to a massacre, but to a slow, agonizing attrition. The end of this civilization was not a dramatic, sudden event. It was a gradual fading out. Perhaps the last survivors pooled their remaining timber to build a final, desperate ship, only to be swallowed by the dark waters of the North Atlantic. Perhaps they finally abandoned their pride and walked away into the snow, seeking refuge with the indigenous Thule hunters, or perhaps they simply died in their homes, farm by farm, valley by valley, as the winters grew too long and the food finally ran out. The tragedy of the Greenland Norse is the tragedy of a society that refused to bend, and so it slowly broke. They built their homes to last centuries, imposing an imported agricultural model onto a fragile Arctic ecosystem. They engineered their own ultimate vulnerability. Today, the stones of Valsey Church remain perfectly aligned, waiting for a congregation that will never return. The wind howls through the empty windows, carrying the same freezing mist that eventually starved the builders out. The ruins are a monument to human endurance, and a stark testament to the absolute supremacy of the environment. A society that survived in the ice for nearly 500 years did not end with a sudden cataclysm. It just quietly ran out of time, leaving behind only the echo of a wedding hymn before fading into total unbroken silence. We leave the creeping glaciers and silent stone ruins of the North Atlantic far behind. Thousands of miles away, the atmospheric pressure shifts from the freezing, brittle winds of Greenland to the heavy, perfumed heat of the Indonesian archipelago. Here, buried beneath thick layers of dense equatorial soil on the island of Sumbawa, lies a single scorched bronze coin. It is permanently fused to a shattered piece of fine imported Chinese ceramic. The metal of the coin has been warped by temperatures so sudden and extreme that its original minted inscriptions are reduced to a smooth, blackened blister. Yet, this melted lump of copper and clay is not a remnant of a primitive, forgotten outpost. It is a forensic anchor to one of the most prosperous cosmopolitan trade hubs of the early 19th century. This was the vibrant kingdom of Tambora. Long before it was reduced to ash and rumour, Tambora was a glittering economic powerhouse commanding the complex maritime networks of Southeast Asia. The kingdom sat upon a lush, wildly fertile peninsula, geographically blessed to dominate the flow of rare luxury commodities. Massive wooden galleons and nimble regional trading vessels dropped anchor in its deep protected harbours, drawn by the island's legendary natural wealth. Tambora was internationally renowned for its deep forest wild honey, a delicacy heavily taxed and fiercely guarded by the local elites. Even more valuable were the kingdom's magnificent horses. The Tambora breed was celebrated across the Eastern Hemisphere for its endurance and physical beauty, traded as far away as the Asian mainland. These animals were considered a mark of supreme political status, gifted between regional monarchs, and purchased at exorbitant prices by colonial military officers. The local merchants also controlled the highly lucrative regional monopoly on sapanwood. This dense, precious timber was harvested from the island's interior and processed to produce brilliant red dyes, feeding the insatiable textile markets of both Europe and Qing dynasty China. Silver, gold, and fine porcelain flowed into the kingdom like a relentless, predictable tide. The capital city of Tambora would have been a daily sensory overload of extreme wealth and globalized exchange. Dutch colonial administrators, Chinese merchants, and indigenous Bugis seafarers negotiated complex trade agreements in crowded, vibrant markets. They stood beneath the shade of massive tropical canopies, trading heavy chests of bronze coins for the island's natural bounty. Beyond the noise of the bustling harbour, the internal agricultural infrastructure was equally masterful. Extensive terraced fields cascaded down the gentle lower slopes of the island's central mountain, fed by predictable monsoon rains. The farmers of Tambora leveraged the incredibly rich, dark soil to produce massive surplus crops, sustaining a dense, highly organised population of tens of thousands. They were a highly distinct civilization, with a cultural identity completely separate from their neighbours. The people of Tambora spoke their own unique non-Austronesian language, a linguistic anomaly that fascinated early European ethnographers. They maintained their own complex political hierarchy, their own distinct spiritual customs, and a fierce, well-earned reputation for territorial independence. Colonial records from the Dutch East India Company describe a kingdom at the absolute zenith of its geopolitical power. Bureaucratic logs and diplomatic letters paint a picture of a landscape completely tamed by human ambition and economic strategy. Dense, impenetrable jungle had been systematically pushed back, replaced by highly organised agriculture, sprawling estates, and thriving rural villages. The rulers of Tambora commanded deep respect from neighbouring islands, their influence rippling outward across the Java Sea. It was a society that had seemingly mastered its tropical environment, turning the rich earth of Sumbawa into an engine of endless generational growth. To a foreign merchant standing in the harbour in the early spring of the year 1815, the kingdom of Tambora would have felt immortal. The massive forested mountain looming quietly behind the capital was viewed merely as a geographic backdrop, a silent guardian anchoring the kingdom's immense wealth. There was no reason for the honey-gatherers, the horse-breeders, or the silver merchants to suspect that the very foundation of their prosperity was entirely temporary. The bustling markets and the distinct, vibrant language of the Tambora people were all functioning in complete ignorance of the deep, subterranean pressure building silently beneath their feet. The heavy, leather-bound ledgers of the Dutch East India Company were monuments of obsessive bureaucratic precision. They recorded every outgoing crate of sapan wood, every sealed jar of deep forest wild honey, and every complex transaction involving the prized horses of the island of Sumbawa. Then, the meticulous ink simply stops. There is no gradual economic decline written into the margins of those colonial logs. You will not find desperate notes detailing slow starvation, nor records of dwindling, tense trade negotiations. The kingdom of Tambora was simply deleted from the historical record. An estimated 10,000 people vanished between one dawn and the next. This bustling port did not slowly empty out and fade into obscurity. Like the distant, freezing settlements of the Greenland Norse, it was utterly, instantly erased from the physical world. We know almost nothing of who these thriving people truly were. They spoke a tongue completely unlike any other spoken by their neighbours on the island. It was a deeply isolated non-Austronesian language, representing a highly unique branch of human thought. Only a phantom, fragmented echo of their daily existence survives today. A passing European administrator, visiting the kingdom shortly before the silence fell, jotted down a mere 48 words of the local vocabulary in his personal journal, 48 scattered, disconnected syllables. He recorded their word for dog, which they called mahi. He noted their word for water, which they pronounced nona. These few casually scribbled nouns are all that remain of a civilization's entire oral history. Imagine an entire complex human experience reduced to a partial vocabulary list on a foreigner's notepad. The rich poetry, the loud harbour negotiations, and the quiet evening prayers of Tambora were gone forever. The cultural memory of an entire people was wiped perfectly clean. The physical reality of the vibrant kingdom suffered the exact same fate. When bewildered colonial expeditions eventually returned to the established maritime coordinates of the thriving port, they found absolutely nothing. The coastline itself had drastically, violently changed shape. Where a highly prosperous capital once stood, there was only a vast, unrecognisable, and totally silent desolation. The deep ancient forests that produced their famous honey were stripped away completely down to the bare bedrock. The very geography of the island was fundamentally broken. This was a powerful society at the absolute peak of its commercial influence. They were deeply and richly integrated into the sprawling global trade networks of the early 19th century. Yet, in the span of a single day, They became a literal blank space on the navigational maps. No desperate refugees ever arrived at the shores of neighbouring islands to tell the tale of what happened. No distress signals were recorded by passing merchant vessels navigating the surrounding ocean straits. The erasure was brutally absolute, encompassing every man, woman and child of the kingdom. The silence that fell over the island of Sumbawa was total and profound. There were no shallow graves to excavate, and no empty, intact farmhouses left standing in the wind. The kingdom of Tambora was simply swallowed by the earth. A thriving cosmopolitan society does not simply evaporate into the thick tropical air. History always demands a physical mechanism for such total, unyielding destruction. How does an entire unique language and a fiercely prosperous people vanish from the face of the earth overnight? A thick layer of compacted pumice rests beneath the modern jungle floor. The Dutch colonial agents who searched for the wealthy kingdom of Tambora failed because they were looking for ruins on the surface of the earth. They did not realise the kingdom was buried 3 metres deep in volcanic glass. In April of the year 1815, the mountain itself tore open. It was not a standard volcanic event, but a geological detonation of an almost incomprehensible scale. The upper third of the towering volcano collapsed inward, vaporising billions of tons of solid rock in mere seconds. 10,000 human lives were extinguished in a single terrifying evening. Superheated avalanches of toxic gas and shattered stone, known as pyroclastic flows, raced down the mountainous slopes at hundreds of kilometres per hour. It swallowed the prosperous timber merchants, the deep forest honey-gatherers, and the handlers of the famous local horses. All of them were instantly entombed in the dark. They had no time to launch their trading vessels, no time to flee into the hills, and no time to leave a final desperate warning. The kingdom simply ceased to be. Heavy ash fell like black snow across the entire island of Sumbawa for days. The peninsula was entirely suffocated under a crushing weight of pulverised earth and sulphur. The scorched bronze coin and the fused Chinese ceramics we observed earlier were trapped in this dark, oxygen-starved vacuum. The people of Tambora were locked in time. Their wooden homes, their bodies, and their unique language were sealed beneath the earth, perfectly preserved in the exact moment of their violent destruction. But the fury of that night did not stay confined to the Indonesian archipelago. We know the precise magnitude of this disaster not just from the local ashes, but from the polar ice. You will recall the ice core climate proxies we examined earlier in our journey. Glaciologists analysing those frozen chronological cylinders from Greenland, the wider European Arctic and remote regions of North America found a terrifying anomaly. Deep within the compacted ice layers corresponding to the early 19th century, scientists detected a massive spike of trapped sulfur dioxide. They did not need to re-examine the mechanics of the frozen bubbles to understand what this sudden, extreme chemical signature meant. It aligned perfectly with the spring of 1815. Mount Tambora had ejected so much sulfur into the upper stratosphere that it fundamentally altered the atmospheric chemistry of the Earth. The mountain did not just bury its own people under local stone. It wrapped the entire northern hemisphere in a highly reflective chemical veil. The ash and sulfur cloud expanded rapidly into the highest altitudes. It caught the global atmospheric currents, spreading a planetary shroud that drifted far beyond the tropics. The local tragedy in Sumbawa was rapidly becoming a global crisis. As the sulfuric veil thickened over Europe and North America, it began to aggressively reflect incoming sunlight back into the void of space. The sudden, overnight disappearance of a single, wealthy Indonesian kingdom was merely the epicenter of a much larger, invisible shockwave. The average temperature of the Earth began to plummet. The global climate system shuddered under this sudden deprivation of solar heat. The terrifying scale of the 1815 eruption was no longer just an isolated archaeological mystery. It was a looming shadow, preparing to test the fragility of civilizations thousands of miles away. The global sulfuric veil did not merely tint the sunsets of the early 19th century. It wrapped the entire Earth in a suffocating reflective shroud. These microscopic ash particles bounced solar radiation back into the cold void of space, systematically stealing the warmth of the sun. Global temperatures plummeted across the northern hemisphere in a matter of months. The year 1816 would soon be etched into historical records under a profoundly grim title. It became universally known as the year without a summer. In the newly formed United States, Heavy snow fell across New England in early June. Rivers froze over in July, trapping wooden boats in unseasonable, jagged ice. Crops withered in the frostbitten fields before they could ever reach the harvest. Across Europe, the persistent, unnatural cold triggered torrential rains and a devastating agricultural collapse. Famine stalked the continent, sparking desperate bread riots and mass migrations of starving peasants. The delicate, interconnected balance of early modern trade fractured under the immense weight of a volcanic winter. Starvation rippled outward, a silent shockwave born from the belly of an Indonesian mountain. Yet, while the Western world documented its shivering misery in Gothic poetry and frantic newspaper accounts, the true tragedy lay back at the epicenter. The people whose land had caused this global shudder were already completely gone. The kingdom of Tambora, with its prized horses and its bustling, wealthy port, did not experience a year without a summer. They experienced an absolute, irreversible end. Their unique non-Austronesian language, their deep forest honey trade, and their daily lives were extinguished in a single, deafening afternoon. This is the ultimate, terrifying limit of human prosperity. We build intricate networks of commerce, accumulate vast cultural wealth, and convince ourselves that we have mastered our environment. We forge bronze coins and trade them for fine Chinese ceramics, believing our legacy is permanently secured. But civilization exists entirely by the silent consent of geology. A single, catastrophic fissure in the earth can rewrite the climate of the entire planet in a matter of days. A thriving kingdom can be reduced to a compacted layer of pumice, waiting 2 centuries for an archaeologist to find its charred, silent remains. The Tambora culture did not slowly fail because of internal corruption, resource mismanagement, or flawed political strategy. They were simply sitting above a catastrophic release valve of the planet. Their sudden disappearance was a matter of pure indifferent physics. There is a profound melancholy in this realization. All of our infrastructure, all of our accumulated knowledge, and all of our human ambitions rest upon a thin, restless crust. When the earth decides to violently clear the board, it does not negotiate with kings or merchants. It simply exhales, and an entire society is completely erased from the timeline. The people of Tambora were consumed by the very mountain that had provided their wealth. Their localized prosperity was a fragile illusion, shattered by the deep ancient forces of the world. The scorched earth of the island of Sumbawa left an indelible scar on the historical record, a terrifying testament to fire and ash. But the destruction of a great society does not always arrive with a deafening roar from the darkened sky. Sometimes it comes far more quietly, rising slowly from the very ground we stand upon. The earth can easily swallow a civilization whole, burying it under millions of tons of shattered rock and volcanic glass. But water, given enough time and shifting climates, is an equally patient and devastating eraser. And far across the ocean, another immense forgotten metropolis was about to learn the terrible cost of ignoring the waters at its gates. Tambora was buried by the sudden fire of the earth, but geology has other methods of erasure. Sometimes a civilization is not shattered by ash. Sometimes it is slowly swallowed by shifting earth and rising water. We leave the scorched archipelagos of Indonesia behind. We cross the globe to the vast, fertile floodplains of North America. Here, rising from the rich soils of the Mississippi River Valley, sits a structure of impossible scale. It is known today as Monk's Mound. It is a towering terraced pyramid, but it is not carved from stone. It is constructed entirely of meticulously packed earth. It rises 100 feet into the sky. Its massive base covers 14 acres of land. That footprint is definitively larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This was not the work of simple foragers. It was an engineering triumph. The mound was built by moving over 50 million cubic feet of earth, carried basket by woven basket, across decades of continuous labour. The builders understood complex soil mechanics. They layered sand, clay and gravel to prevent the massive structure from collapsing under its own weight. It was the physical anchor of a sprawling metropolis. This is Cahokia. In the 11th century, it was the absolute centre of a vast continental empire. If you were to stand in its grand plaza in the year 1050, you would not find a quiet, pastoral village. You would find yourself standing in a city larger than London or Paris at that exact same moment in history. At its peak, Up to 20,000 people lived within the immediate urban core. Tens of thousands more populated the dense suburbs that radiated outward for miles. It was a vibrant, noisy, and profoundly complex urban landscape. Stand at the summit of Monk's Mound and look out across the valley. The view would be staggering in its sheer scale. Directly below you, the Grand Plaza stretches out across 40 acres, levelled entirely by hand to create a perfectly flat civic space. Surrounding this plaza are over 100 smaller mounds. There are towering astronomical timber circles, acting as precise solar calendars. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasting venison and crushed maize. The avenues are crowded with citizens, merchants, and foreign diplomats. It is a deeply cosmopolitan hub. Travellers walk the packed dirt roads speaking dozens of different dialects. They are drawn together by the immense political and spiritual gravity of the city. Cahokia was the undisputed capital of the Mississippian culture. Its unprecedented wealth was built on a staggering web of trade. The rivers acted as ancient superhighways, connecting the city to the farthest reaches of the continent. The reach of their merchants was truly continental. Artisans in the city workshops hammered brilliant copper, mined hundreds of miles away near the Great Lakes. They carved intricate ornaments from marine shells carried up from the Gulf of Mexico. They shaped glittering sheets of mica brought down from the Appalachian Mountains. This was a society of master engineers, precise astronomers, and ruthless political leaders. They understood the deep rhythms of the sun and the stars. They understood the seasonal flood patterns of the mighty rivers that fed their crops. To live in Cahokia was to live at the centre of the known world. The city hummed with the constant rhythmic noise of organised human labour. Heavy canoes crowded the waterways, low in the water under the weight of trade goods. A massive defensive palisade built from 20,000 thick wooden logs enclosed the central precinct. It was a place of endless motion and supreme confidence. It was not a fragile, temporary encampment. It was a monumental capital, designed by its architects to stand forever. Yet today, it is nothing more than quiet, grassy hills. Consider a single, rotting wooden post buried deep in the Illinois soil. It is a remnant of the massive defensive palisade that once encircled the heart of Cahokia. The kingdom of Tambora was erased overnight by the catastrophic violence of geology. Cahokia suffered a very different fate. Its end was not a sudden execution by fire and ash, but a slow, agonizing exhalation. The great wooden wall required 20,000 oak and hickory trees to construct. It was a monument of defensive panic, demanding unimaginable labour to fell, transport, and install the massive timbers. Archaeological excavations reveal that this fortification was rebuilt and reinforced at least 4 times over the decades. But the final iteration tells a story of profound systemic exhaustion. Post holes for the newest defensive wall were meticulously dug into the earth. Yet many were never filled. Massive logs were left to rot beside their designated trenches, abandoned mid-lift by a workforce that simply stopped showing up. This creeping paralysis moved slowly inward, toward the shadow of Monk's Mound. For generations, the Grand Plaza was swept clean daily, functioning as a pristine stage for the height of Mississippian culture. Then the civic discipline faltered. Refuse began to accumulate in the sacred spaces. Trash pits, which had previously been carefully managed and covered with soil to maintain urban sanitation, were left open to the elements. Broken ceramics, animal bones, and daily waste spilled out into the once immaculate thoroughfares. The civic immune system of the metropolis was breaking down. Yet, when modern archaeologists search for the ultimate cause of this city's death, they find themselves staring at an anomaly. They look for the usual violent signatures of civilizational collapse. They look for the compacted ash layers of a catastrophic citywide fire. They look for mass graves hastily filled with the victims of a sudden devastating pathogen. They look for thousands of skeletons bearing the unmistakable marks of enemy arrows or crushed skulls. At Cahokia, the earth offers none of these answers. There was no apocalyptic massacre. There was no sudden, localized extinction event. Instead, the physical evidence points to a chillingly quiet withdrawal. The metropolis was not conquered by an invading army. It was slowly, deliberately abandoned by its own people. It began at the edges of the sprawl. The farming hamlets in the outer suburbs were the first to go quiet. Families packed up their most valuable tools, abandoned their wattle and daub homes and walked away, leaving their hearths to grow cold. Without constant maintenance, these earthen houses quickly began to melt back into the mud under the seasonal rains. For those who remained in the city centre, the daily reality would have been deeply unsettling. They were living in a metropolis where entire neighbourhoods were slowly dissolving into ruin around them. Over the decades, this silence contracted inward, tightening like a noose. The grand ceremonial fires ceased burning. The constant hum of tens of thousands of voices faded to a hollow whisper. This is the unique terror of gradual abandonment. It is a slow-motion collapse that takes generations to complete, yet remains entirely unstoppable to those trapped within its current. A city dying not with a scream, but with 1,000 quiet, desperate departures. The grand earthen pyramids remained, standing watch over an increasingly empty plain. The population scattered into the surrounding river valleys, fragmenting their highly complex society into smaller, decentralized bands, which leaves us with a profound forensic mystery. If there was no overwhelming invading army, no volcanic winter, and no sudden disease, what unseen force could break a society of this magnitude? How does a thriving metropolis of tens of thousands simply dissolve into the river mist? A heavy aluminum tube plunges through the dark, still waters of Horseshoe Lake. This quiet body of water rests just a few miles from the looming shadow of Monk's Mound. It has sat undisturbed for centuries, silently recording everything the land endured. Geologists use mechanical winches to drive these metal cylinders deep into the lake bed. They cut downward through centuries of compressed underwater earth. When the winch finally pulls the tube back to the surface, it extracts a continuous timeline of physical history. These are lake sediment cores. Back in the laboratory, scientists carefully slice the long metal tubes open lengthwise. The exposed column smells sharply of ancient damp decay. To a casual observer, the core is simply a long smear of wet dirt. To an environmental scientist, it is a high-resolution ledger of survival and catastrophe. The visual contrast within the mud is stark and deeply unsettling. Most of the cylinder consists of dark, tightly packed organic material. This rich black soil represents long stretches of stable climate. It is the peaceful accumulation of decaying leaves, airborne pollen, and quiet water. This dark mud is the signature of the predictable seasons that allowed Cahokia to thrive. It represents the reliable rains that sustained tens of thousands of people. But this dark harmony is violently interrupted. Slicing horizontally across the black mud are thick, glaring bands of pale, sterile clay. These pale scars are entirely alien to the slow accumulation of a quiet lake. They are the unmistakable geological fingerprint of rushing, violent water. They are the permanent signatures of megafloods. To carry clay of this density into Horseshoe Lake, the Mississippi River had to swell into a terrifying inland sea. The river tore up the fundamental architecture of the floodplain, carrying heavy sediment miles inland before dropping it. The lake sediment cores reveal a relentless, punishing rhythm to these disasters. They provide exact physical dates for the city's silent unravelling. Around the year 1150, the first massive band of pale clay strikes across the core. This aligns perfectly with the exact decades the Grand Plaza began to fill with uncollected refuse. A second, thicker band of catastrophic clay gouges through the timeline around the year 1200. This second strike matches the precise period when the great defensive palisades were abandoned. The science paints a grim, undeniable picture. The great metropolis was drowning. Imagine the visceral reality of a Mississippian megaflood. The mathematically precise agricultural grid surrounding the city would vanish under millions of gallons of churning brown water. The vast network of fields that fed the urban core was weaponized against its own creators. When the violent waters finally receded, they did not leave behind fertile planting soil. They deposited a suffocating blanket of sterile sand and dense clay over the cultivated earth. The meticulously tended cornfields were instantly transformed into a barren wasteland. Winter stores of dried grain, carefully stockpiled in low-lying wooden granaries, would have been saturated and ruined. A single mega-flood meant immediate, unavoidable famine for a densely packed population. The sediment cores proved these events happened repeatedly, hammering a society stretched to its limit. The physical destruction of the crops was only the beginning of the collapse. Cahokia was governed by an elite whose entire authority rested on their supposed ability to control the natural world. When the river repeatedly wiped out the food supply, it shattered the ideological foundation of the civilization. The rulers living atop Monk's Mound had clearly lost their divine mandate. Their rituals could no longer hold back the water. This explains the eerie lack of mass graves or sudden battle markers in the archaeological record. The people of Cahokia simply realized that the land could no longer sustain their monumental ambition. Starving and disillusioned, they packed up their belongings and walked away. They traded the extreme vulnerability of a massive urban centre for the resilient safety of scattered villages. The megafloods were the undeniable trigger for this quiet emptying. Yet, the water alone does not entirely explain why the land became so catastrophically vulnerable in the first place. The pale clay bands locked inside the sediment of Horseshoe Lake tell only half the story. To understand why those surging waters proved absolutely fatal, we have to look at the altered landscape. The river did not destroy this civilization entirely on its own. The city had inadvertently stripped away its only natural armour. Decades before the catastrophic waters broke their banks, the rulers of this vast metropolis faced a growing, localized pressure. They needed to secure the sacred centre of their world from rising social tensions. Their solution was the construction of a monumental 2-mile wooden palisade. This towering defensive wall wrapped entirely around the central administrative district, enclosing the Grand Plaza and the Great Earthen Pyramids. It was a staggering, deeply impressive feat of civic engineering. But a fortification of that sheer magnitude requires an almost unimaginable harvest of raw timber. Workers had to fell approximately 20,000 mature oak and hickory trees just to build the first iteration of the wall. Over the following century, the inhabitants rebuilt and expanded that palisade at least 3 separate times. This relentless demand for heavy lumber required the systematic clear-cutting of the surrounding upland forests. Thousands of acres of ancient, deeply rooted canopy were systematically erased by stone axes and fire. This extreme deforestation set a silent, invisible trap across the entire region. Old-growth forests act as a landscape's natural shock absorbers. Their dense, overlapping branches shatter the violent momentum of torrential rains, turning heavy storms into gentle mist. Below ground, their deep, interwoven root systems act like a vast subterranean net, anchoring the topsoil firmly in place. When those trees vanished, the structural integrity of the entire watershed vanished with them. The heavy seasonal rains returned to a naked landscape. Without the protective canopy, falling water hammered directly into the exposed fragile earth. Without the deep roots to bind it, the nutrient-rich topsoil simply liquefied under the deluge. It washed rapidly down the bare slopes in thick, suffocating torrents of mud. This unchecked, violent runoff poured directly into the delicate network of streams and agricultural canals that fed the massive population. The landscape was rapidly bleeding out its agricultural lifeblood. The very soil needed to grow food was being swept away into the river system. By the time the Mississippian megafloods finally surged over the riverbanks, they struck an environment that had already been critically compromised from within. The natural forested barrier that would normally slow the floodwaters was entirely gone. The flood easily scoured the remaining topsoil away, depositing those thick, sterile layers of pale clay over the once fertile farmlands. This triggered a rapid, systemic agricultural collapse across the entire region. The vast, carefully tended fields of maize that sustained tens of thousands of citizens could no longer take root. The soil was choked, barren, and utterly exhausted. The harvest failed catastrophically, not just for one unlucky season, but repeatedly over several decades. Stored granaries slowly emptied out, and no new surplus arrived to replace the missing grain. The highly organized, complex society began to buckle under the grinding, inescapable pressure of widespread famine. Yet this was not a failure of intelligence or poor planning. It was a tragic, almost inevitable paradox of urban scaling. The leaders of Cahokia were simply attempting to protect their people and project stability. They identified a human threat, and they engineered a magnificent defense to keep that threat at bay. But the massive scale of their solution permanently altered the local ecology. Every great oak cut down to fortify the central plaza weakened the earth miles away. Every heavy log added to the defensive perimeter brought the eventual starvation of the city one step closer. Their relentless pursuit of security created an insurmountable vulnerability. The very wooden shield meant to defend the city from its enemies ultimately invited the water that starved its citizens. The Great Migration away from the floodplain was not a sudden, violent stampede. It was a quiet, generational exodus born of exhaustion and depleted soil. Families packed what little they could carry and simply walked away from the failing urban grid. The Grand Plaza, once vibrating with the footsteps of thousands, grew eerily still. Without the constant maintenance of human hands, the environment moved swiftly to reclaim its stolen territory. Rain washed unchecked down the terraced faces of the great earthen pyramids. The bare, compacted soil of the urban centre began to soften and crack under the baking sun. Seeds carried by the wind found easy purchase in the abandoned hearths and empty storage pits. Within a few short decades, the carefully engineered drainage canals choked with silt and river weeds. The towering wooden defensive palisades began to rot from the damp ground up. Termites and beetles systematically dismantled the grand cedar structures that once crowned the summits of the mounds. Saplings rooted themselves deep in the sacred ash of the plaza fires. The engineered metropolis was slowly digested by the prairie, turning rigid architecture back into wild landscape. Monk's Mound itself, the colossal centerpiece of the Mississippian culture, lost its sharp geometry. Heavy rains smoothed its hard artificial edges into gentle rolling natural slopes. Thick prairie grass blanketed the monstrous earthwork, weaving a green shroud over the millions of baskets of soil carried by human hands. The city was not destroyed, it was simply absorbed. This quiet burial birthed a profound historical amnesia. By the time the first French explorers drifted down the nearby river networks in the 17th century, the metropolis was entirely invisible. They looked out over the vast bottomlands and saw only what they believed was pristine wilderness. They had no idea they were navigating the decaying corpse of a staggering urban empire. The irony is a heavy one. Later, European settlers built their own small farms right on top of the ancient plazas, grazing cattle on the slopes of the lesser mounds. They were completely unaware of the precise urban grid buried just beneath their boots. When 19th century scholars finally noticed the unnatural symmetry of the remaining hills, they could not comprehend their origin. They invented wild theories of lost wandering tribes or ancient vanished giants. They were fundamentally unable to accept that the indigenous people they were displacing had built a city rivaling medieval London. Yet the original builders of this massive complex had not simply ceased to exist. They had not been wiped out by a singular plague or a dramatic massacre. They had recognized the fatal failure of their massive urban experiment and chosen to adapt to survive. The population dispersed into smaller, more resilient communities across the plains. Their descendants became the Osage, the Ponca, the Omaha, and other thriving indigenous nations. They traded the fragile complexity of the megacity for the sustainable mobility of the village. But the specific memory of the great city faded into myth, even among the distant descendants of its architects. The physical reality of Cahokia was swallowed so completely by the earth that it became a literal ghost. It stands today as a haunting testament to how quickly nature can erase our most arrogant monuments. We build our own modern cities with the assumption that our footprint is permanent. But Cahokia proves that even the most massive earthworks can be muted by a few centuries of rain and creeping grass. This quiet erasure is not unique to the floodplains of North America. Across the ocean, in the cradle of ancient global trade, a much louder, far more violent collapse was waiting to unfold. While the great North American metropolis faded into a green whisper, the interconnected empires of the ancient Mediterranean were preparing to burn. While the great earthen mounds of the American floodplain faded into quiet green anonymity, another world had long since burned. We leave the gentle, consuming earth of the Mississippi River and cross the globe, moving backward through the centuries. We arrive at the shores of the eastern Mediterranean, in the late 13th century before the Common Era. Deep in the ruins of the ancient Syrian port city of Ugarit, modern excavators uncovered a small, unassuming block of clay. It is a hasty, terrified letter. The cuneiform script is pressed deeply into the surface, driven by a panicked hand. The message is addressed to the king of Al-Ashir, located on modern-day Cyprus. The words are direct. They read, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." The scribe never sent the letter. Before the courier could carry it to the harbour, the city walls were breached and the royal palace was set ablaze. The inferno that destroyed Ugarit burned so intensely that it served as an impromptu kiln, baking this very clay tablet into the collapsing floor, preserving its desperate final breath for over 3,000 years. To understand the terror etched into that hardened mud, you must understand the magnitude of the world that was falling apart. This was not a scattered collection of isolated warring tribes. This was the late Bronze Age. It was an era of unprecedented, breathtaking globalization. For hundreds of years, a highly sophisticated, deeply interconnected network of empires spanned the known world. The Egyptians in the south, the Hittites of central Anatolia, the Mycenaeans of mainland Greece, and the Canaanite coastal kingdoms operated a massive, complex international system. They were bound together by delicate diplomacy and a relentless, insatiable demand for bronze. Bronze required copper and tin, two resources almost never found naturally together. To forge the metal that defined their entire age, built their monuments, and armed their soldiers, these empires were forced to trade across thousands of miles of open water and treacherous terrain. Merchant ships heavy with raw ivory, oxide-shaped copper ingots, fragrant terebinth resin, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan crisscrossed the Mediterranean Sea. Royal courts exchanged royal brides, gold from Nubia, and meticulously polite letters written in Akkadian, the universal diplomatic language of the day. Elite rulers referred to one another as brother in their correspondence, managing trade deficits, resolving border disputes, and negotiating military alliances with the bureaucratic precision of a modern nation-state. It was a delicate, tightly wound mechanism. A disruption anywhere in this vast interlocking supply chain sent immediate shockwaves everywhere else. If pirates blockaded a port in the Levant, a blacksmith in the Peloponnese could not cast his weapons. The city of Ugarit was a crucial, wealthy node in this sprawling, prosperous machine. It was a cosmopolitan hub where merchants from a dozen different nations mingled in the streets, traded exotic goods, and kept meticulous multilingual ledgers. It was a society built entirely on predictability, on the fundamental assumption that the trade winds would blow, the ships would always arrive, and the royal treaties would always hold. But the tablet baked in the ruins of Ugarit tells us that the predictability shattered. The ships that arrived on that final day did not carry copper, or grain, or diplomatic envoys. They carried destruction. The burning of Ugarit was not an isolated local tragedy. It was merely one domino falling in a sequence of unparalleled continent-spanning violence. The entire interconnected machine of the late Bronze Age was about to tear itself apart. The sophisticated bureaucracy, the strategic marriages, and the massive merchant fleets could not stop the rapid, total unravelling of the civilized world. A dark age was descending upon the Mediterranean, one so sudden and complete that the very art of writing would soon vanish from Greece for hundreds of years. The grand palaces were about to be reduced to ash, leaving modern science to sift through the charcoal, searching for the spark that ignited the collapse. The fire that baked that final clay tablet in Ugarit was not an isolated tragedy. It was the spark of a continent-spanning inferno. The flames were just one point in a grid of synchronized destruction. To grasp the sheer scale of this collapse, we must look down into the soil. Archaeologists excavating the great Mediterranean centres routinely strike a very specific, undeniable geological marker. It is a thick, undisturbed band of compacted black ash. This dark stratum represents the violent, abrupt end of the late Bronze Age. It is the physical residue of a burning world. Trace this ash layer across the ancient map. It does not remain confined to the Syrian coast. It stretches aggressively north into the rugged highlands of central Anatolia. There, the capital of the Hittite Empire was entirely consumed. Hattusa was a legendary fortress city, guarded by massive stone lions and built to withstand prolonged sieges. Yet its impenetrable walls were breached, and its royal archives were incinerated. The ash layer beneath Hattusa is deep and absolute. The empire vanished into the smoke. Move west across the Aegean Sea to the rocky coast of mainland Greece. The Mycenaeans met the exact same fate. Their heavily fortified hilltop citadels were systematically dismantled and burned. Pylos, Tiryns, and Mycenae itself all collapsed into smoking ruins. The great palaces of the Greek heroes were reduced to scorched earth. Go east, back toward the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. The wealthy Canaanite port kingdoms were levelled one by one. Megiddo, Hazor, and Ashkelon were all shattered and left to burn. Look north toward the storied walls of Troy. The archaeological record proves it was destroyed by catastrophic fire during this exact same historical window. City after city, the ground tells the same charred story. This was not a slow, gentle fading away spread out over centuries. This was an abrupt, cascading failure of human civilization. Radiocarbon dating and ceramic analysis reveal a terrifyingly compressed timeline. The vast majority of these major urban centres fell within a single human lifetime. The devastation occurred primarily in the early to middle decades of the 12th century BCE. A span of perhaps 50 years saw the complete erasure of a world order that had stood for over 2 millennia. The speed of the collapse defies traditional historical logic. The physical destruction of the cities was absolute, but the administrative silence was even more profound. The intricate web of Bronze Age globalization simply evaporated. The heavy, oxide-shaped copper ingots stopped crossing the sea from ancient Cyprus. The luxury trade of lapis lazuli and tin from the distant east went completely dark. The complex, highly specialized supply chains that kept the world running were severed overnight. Most chilling of all was the sudden death of international diplomacy. For centuries, kings had written to each other in the Akkadian language, sharing news, arranging marriages, and trading gold. Then, the letters simply stopped. The palaces that housed the scribes were nothing but smouldering craters. The voices of the ancient world went entirely mute. When you map these destruction layers together, a terrifying pattern emerges. It is the definitive geography of a systemic collapse. A localized natural disaster might destroy a single city. A targeted regional war might topple a single empire, but the late Bronze Age world was far too interconnected for an isolated tragedy. When one kingdom fell, it created an immediate economic vacuum. When the tin supply stopped moving, bronze weapons could not be forged to defend the next city. When the grain ships ceased sailing, massive urban populations began to starve. The dominoes were stacked entirely too closely together. Once the momentum of collapse began, the highly specialized global system could not correct itself. The very interconnectedness that created their golden age became the exact mechanism of their mutual destruction. Every empire fell because every empire relied on the others to survive, yet the ashes leave us with a massive forensic void. We know precisely when the cities burned. We know exactly how quickly the darkness spread across the map, but we're still left staring at the charcoal, trying to identify the initial spark. What force is capable of destroying an entire globalized system at once? For over a century, historians pointed to a single, terrifying culprit to explain the thick black ash layers covering the ancient world. They called them the Sea Peoples. It is a haunting name for an enigmatic force, traditionally understood as a relentless tide of maritime marauders who swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Our primary image of these invaders comes from the mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu in Egypt. Carved deep into the immense stone walls is a chaotic, triumphant battle scene. Egyptian archers fire down from the shores onto a tangle of foreign ships, piercing warriors who wear strange feathered headdresses and horned helmets. This forms the foundation of the accepted reading of the collapse. A mysterious confederation of pirates and warlords materialized from the sea, overwhelming the civilized world with sheer numbers and unpredictable savagery. The story claims they burned the Hittite capital, sacked the wealthy Canaanite coastal hubs, and brought the vast trade networks to an abrupt, violent halt. The Egyptian pharaoh recorded a glorious victory against them. He boasted that his forces trapped the invaders at the mouth of the Nile, saving his kingdom from the total annihilation that had consumed his northern neighbours. The narrative is neat, deeply dramatic, and provides a convenient human face to the apocalypse. But this traditional theory harbours a profound logical failure. The empires of the late 12th century BC were not fragile, defenceless targets waiting to be plundered. They possessed the most formidable, highly organised military machines the human race had ever constructed. Consider the armies of the Hittites or the Mycenaeans. They deployed massive squadrons of heavy bronze-plated chariots, coordinated by professional officer classes and supplied by deep, state-run logistical networks. Their rulers operated from behind cyclopean stone walls, fortresses specifically engineered to withstand prolonged organised sieges. Now look closer at the details preserved on those Egyptian temple walls. The Sea Peoples are not depicted as a highly disciplined, technologically superior imperial army. They fight without heavy bronze armour, carrying only simple infantry weapons against the sophisticated arsenals of the great kings. The most glaring anomaly is found at the edges of the battle carvings. Trailing just behind the foreign warriors are heavy, slow-moving wooden ox carts filled with women, children, and meagre possessions. These are not professional conquerors executing a master military strategy. They are desperate, displaced families on the move. This is where the military logic fractures. How does a disjointed fleet of unarmoured refugees systematically dismantle the fortified, chariot-wielding superpowers of the ancient world? A starving, displaced population simply cannot outmaneuver thousands of professional soldiers on a fortified battlefield, let alone orchestrate the simultaneous destruction of a dozen heavily defended capitals. The monumental carvings in Egypt are royal propaganda. They were designed to magnify the divine glory of the pharaoh, not to serve as an objective autopsy of a collapsing era. Ramses III was fighting a desperate defensive action against a massive wave of starving migrants, effectively turning a grim border crisis into a legendary triumph in stone. The Sea Peoples were entirely real, and their violent raids certainly accelerated the chaos along the coastlines. But treating them as the singular cause of the Bronze Age collapse is like blaming a scavenger for the death of a giant. They were a symptom of a dying system, not the root disease. Something else must have already paralysed the chariot armies, emptied the royal grain silos, and fractured the intricate supply chains long before the first foreign sail appeared on the horizon. The great empires were already hollowing out from the inside. To find the true mechanism of their destruction, we have to look past the bronze swords and look down into the microscopic records of the earth itself. To understand how an entire interconnected world broke apart, we must look past the battlefield. We must look down into the microscopic layers of mud resting at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee. Here, modern environmental science provides a stronger alternative to the narrative of invincible maritime raiders. Researchers extracting sediment cores from these ancient waters and from coastal lakes in Cyprus found something deeply unsettling. They were looking for fossilized pollen. This microscopic dust acts as an incorruptible record of what was growing in the 12th century before Christ. The pollen record reveals a sudden, catastrophic drop in Mediterranean oak and pine trees. In their place, only the sparse, desperate weeds of a desert ecosystem managed to survive. This was not a temporary dry spell. It was a mega drought of staggering proportions. The data shows a severe, unrelenting lack of rainfall that lasted for 300 years. It was a climatic death sentence for societies built on the assumption of predictable agricultural surpluses. Try to imagine the human reality behind this data. In the sprawling wheat fields surrounding Hattusa, the once fertile soil simply baked into cracked clay. The rivers feeding the great Mycenaean citadels reduced to muddy, stagnant trickles. Year after year, the royal granaries stood empty. A highly advanced civilization can survive one famine by leaning on its globalized trade network. But when the drought strikes every trading partner simultaneously, the network becomes a transmission vector for starvation. Yet the changing climate was only the first blow. The Earth itself was preparing a second, equally devastating assault on these empires. We know this through the emerging field of archaeoseismology, which measures ancient tremors hidden in ruined stone. The eastern Mediterranean sits atop a highly volatile web of intersecting tectonic plates. Usually these faults release their pressure in isolated events spaced over centuries. But geological records indicate that during the late Bronze Age collapse, the region experienced a seismic storm. A seismic storm is a terrifying sequence where one major earthquake transfers stress and triggers another along adjacent fault lines. Between the year 1225 and 1175 before Christ, the ground simply would not stop shaking. This creates a cascading chain of catastrophic tremors. We can see the visceral human cost of this seismic storm buried in the rubble. At Mycenae, archaeologists found the skeletons of citizens crushed beneath the massive stone blocks of their own homes. The towering walls of Troy show the warped buckling pattern of tectonic shearing. This fundamentally changes how we read the thick black ash layers found across the ancient Mediterranean. For generations, historians assumed this ash was the definitive calling card of the Sea Peoples. It was viewed as undeniable proof of cities put to the torch by invaders. But crushed stone and warped foundations tell a much darker story. When a magnitude 8 earthquake shatters a densely packed Bronze Age city, Domestic hearth fires and olive oil lamps are instantly overturned. Flames quickly spread through the shattered timber and collapsed roofs. A city can burn completely to the ground without a single invader ever drawing a sword. The tension is almost unbearable when we stack these disasters together. The skies refused to rain, while the ground violently buckled beneath their feet. It was an environmental and geological perfect storm. The intricate supply chains of copper and tin were severed by a total systemic failure. The kings who once wrote polite diplomatic letters were suddenly ruling over starving, terrified populations. Bureaucratic brilliance meant nothing against a 300-year drought and 50 years of continuous earthquakes. The sheer scale of the natural catastrophe fractured the very foundation of their reality. These empires were not murdered, they were systematically disassembled by the earth itself. When we merge the violent destruction layers with the fossilized pollen of a 300-year drought, a chilling new picture emerges. The Great Invasion theory begins to look entirely different. The invaders were not the root cause of the collapse, but a desperate symptom of it. Look again at the royal propaganda carved into the stone at the Medinet Habu temple. Amidst the chaotic depictions of sinking ships and victorious Egyptian archers, there is a quieter, far more tragic detail. The mysterious invaders did not come alone. The reliefs clearly show heavy wooden ox carts with solid lumbering wheels. Inside these crude wagons sit women, children, and meagre worldly possessions. These were not elite military strike forces bent on global domination. They were starving climate refugees. Fleeing their own parched homelands across the Mediterranean, they were moving in a state of absolute desperation. They were simply looking for a place where the rain still fell. This realization changes our entire understanding of the late Bronze Age collapse. The mighty empires of the Hittites and the Mycenaeans did not fall because they were outmatched in battle by superior warriors. They were already rotting from within long before the first foreign ships appeared on their horizons. Decades of relentless drought had emptied the massive royal granaries. When the harvests failed year after year, the kings could no longer feed their sprawling urban populations. A starving populace is a deeply unstable one. This introduces the terrifying reality of systemic supply chain fragility. In a highly globalized world, power relies on incredibly complex networks of trade, diplomacy, and distribution. When those networks fracture, the entire structure shatters. Consider the primary weapon of the era, the bronze chariot. It was the ultimate symbol of imperial military supremacy, thundering across the battlefields of the ancient Near East. Yet, it was fundamentally useless without a functioning international supply chain. To build and maintain a chariot force, a kingdom needed vast amounts of imported resources. It required copper from ancient Cyprus, and tin transported thousands of miles overland from the distant mountains of Central Asia. It required specialized artisans, well-fed horses, and immense daily rations of grain. When the rain stopped, the grain vanished. Without grain, the horses starved, and the skilled bronze workers likely rebelled or fled. The great supply lines of lapis lazuli and tin simply evaporated into the arid wind. A powerful king cannot pay his elite guard with oxhide-shaped copper ingots if there is no food left to buy. The legendary chariot armies found themselves grounded, hungry, and entirely impotent. They were utterly paralyzed when the desperate migrations finally began. The sea peoples simply walked into a hollowed-out world. They pushed against heavy fortress doors that were already rotting on their hinges. The sprawling palace economies were too optimized, too interconnected, and far too brittle to survive the compound pressure of drought and migration. If one kingdom fell, its collapse immediately severed the trade routes keeping its neighbors alive. It was a deadly domino effect cascading relentlessly across the known world. The sudden destruction of Hattusa meant inevitable starvation in the Canaanite coastal kingdoms. The burning of Mycenaean palaces on mainland Greece choked off vital maritime trade to the Levant. Every empire was tied together by invisible, fragile threads of commerce and mutual dependence. When the changing climate severed those threads, the descent into chaos was breathtakingly fast. The highly advanced bureaucratic states could not adapt to a sudden, prolonged era of absolute scarcity. Their rigid administrative systems were designed exclusively for managing abundance and taxing wealth, not rationing survival. They collapsed under the overwhelming weight of their own complexity. The monumental stone walls of Troy and Mycenae were built to withstand armies of conquerors. They were not designed to hold back a rising tide of starving families driven by massive ecological collapse. A wall cannot protect a city from the failure of its own crops. The scribes who recorded the final, desperate days on clay tablets could not comprehend the scale of the disaster. They believed the gods had abandoned them, unaware that they were victims of a shifting global climate system. They watched their interconnected world burn, unable to stop the cascading systemic failure. The tragedy of the Bronze Age is a mirror reflecting the inherent risks of advanced civilization. It reveals the terrifying fragility of any society built on interconnected, hyper-optimized supply networks spanning vast distances. A globalized world is only as strong as its weakest harvest. Once the delicate balance of import and export was broken, centuries of progress unraveled in a single generation. The great cities did not just lose their wealth, they lost their fundamental ability to sustain human life. The grand experiment of Bronze Age globalization had failed. Let us pause at the edge of the archaeological record. Science can measure the duration of a drought and map the epicenter of a seismic storm. It cannot always track the footsteps of a displaced people. The explicit limit of our modern forensic autopsy lies with the refugees themselves. We still do not know exactly who the Sea Peoples were. We do not know the specific valleys they fled, nor do we have a complete map of where they ultimately resettled. The physical evidence they left behind is painfully fragmented. Consider a specific type of ceramic found scattered along the Levantine coast, known to archaeologists as Mycenaean 3C ware. It is a humble, unpainted style of pottery. The clay is locally sourced Canaanite mud, but the shape and firing technique are distinctly Greek. It is the physical remnant of a displaced people trying to hold on to a lost culture in a new land. Yet, a broken pot does not give us a written history. It only gives us a ghost. Egyptian scribes meticulously carved the names of the invading coalitions into the stone walls of the Medinet Habu temple. They recorded the Peliset, the Shurden, the Lucca, and the Ekwesh. We can pronounce these ancient names today, 3,000 years later. We still cannot point to a definitive homeland for most of them. The names float in a historical void, detached from any surviving capital city or royal archive. It is deeply tempting to fill this uncomfortable silence with grand, sweeping myths. People have spent centuries trying to link these anonymous maritime wanderers to lost continents or legendary phantom empires. The grounded reality of the dirt and ash tells a much more sobering story. History rarely provides perfectly clean answers. These groups were not a unified armada of conquerors acting on a grand strategic vision. The material evidence suggests a messy, chaotic coalition of starving sailors, broken militias, and displaced farmers. They were pushing heavy ox carts with solid wooden wheels across unforgiving terrain. They were moving because their previous home could no longer support human life. They were refugees of systemic collapse, caught in a massive environmental tragedy they did not understand. Where did they go once the great coastal cities burned? A fraction of them, particularly the group identified as the Peliset, likely settled along the southern coastal strip of the Levant. Over generations, the archaeological record suggests they assimilated, eventually becoming the people known later as the Philistines. The vast majority of the Sea Peoples simply vanished into the fractured landscape. They melted into the local populations or died along the harsh coastal roads. They left no grand monuments to mark their ultimate destination. This is the humbling boundary of environmental archaeology. Sediment cores from the Sea of Galilee can tell us exactly when the long rains failed. Archaeoseismology can show us the precise fault lines that shattered the palace walls. These empirical tools cannot tell us what language a mother spoke as she packed her remaining bronze tools into a cart. They cannot record the grief of a merchant realizing the global trade networks were dead forever. The human experience of the collapse remains trapped beneath a thick, black layer of ash. The archaeological record is merely a shattered mirror. We pick up isolated pieces of foreign bronze swords and fragments of desperate clay tablets. The complete picture of this mass migration is lost to time. The survivors of the late Bronze Age collapse did not have the resources to document their journey. They were entirely consumed by the brutal daily mathematics of surviving in a broken world. As the 12th century before Christ dragged on, the surviving populations turned inward. The grand, interconnected engines of civilization simply ground to a halt. The complex diplomatic letters written in Akkadian ceased to flow between royal courts. The heavy, oxhide-shaped copper ingots stopped moving across the Mediterranean Sea. The long-distance supply chains for lapis lazuli and tin were severed, overgrown and forgotten. The world shrank from a vast, cosmopolitan network to the immediate terrifying horizon of the next valley. A profound, heavy silence began to settle over the ruins. The smoke eventually cleared over the Mediterranean basin. The great fires that consumed the palaces of mainland Greece and central Anatolia burned down to white, cooling ash. A profound and unsettling silence settled over the ruins. The intricate web of Bronze Age globalization simply snapped. There were no more ships carrying heavy, oxide-shaped copper ingots across the sea. The vital lapis lazuli and tin trade routes, stretching all the way to the mountains of Central Asia, went entirely dark. Without these critical supply lines, the empires could not sustain their monumental scale. The survivors scattered into the hills and isolated valleys. They abandoned the charred coastal centres for defensible rocky highlands. The world shrank overnight. Grand, interconnected kingdoms fractured into small, suspicious villages. Their focus narrowed from international diplomacy to the brutal, immediate reality of mere survival. But the most devastating casualty of this collapse was not architectural. It was intellectual. In the desperate scramble to endure a collapsing world, the specialized skills of the palace scribes became utterly worthless. When the harvest fails and the cities burn, no one needs an accountant. Writing itself was abandoned. The complex syllabic script known to modern archaeologists as Linear B vanished entirely from the Greek mainland. For nearly 400 years, the region fell into a profound silence. No one recorded a harvest, a trade agreement, or a prayer to the gods. The collective memory of a sophisticated civilization evaporated. This is the true, lingering terror of civilizational amnesia. A society can literally forget how to read and write its own language in a matter of a few generations. The clay tablets, baked hard by the very fires that destroyed the palaces, became incomprehensible relics. The descendants of the scribes would hold these fragments, tracing the impressions in the clay. They had no idea what the symbols meant. Memory decayed rapidly into myth, and history was replaced by folklore. Centuries later, the classical Greeks would walk among the ruins of their ancestors. They would look upon the massive interlocking stone fortifications of Mycenaean Tiryns with sheer bewilderment. The blocks were so impossibly large, they concluded they must have been built by a race of one-eyed giants. They called them Cyclopean walls. They had entirely forgotten the engineering genius of their own grandfathers. It is a deeply sobering realization. A fully connected, globally aware, literate world can be reduced to scattered, illiterate tribes in the span of a single human lifetime. Complexity is not a permanent state of human existence. It is a highly fragile condition that requires constant, exhausting maintenance. When the underlying systems break, the intellectual capital of centuries can vanish like mist over the sea. The Mediterranean entered a deep, quiet, dark age. The knowledge of the past was swallowed by the earth, waiting thousands of years for modern scholars to unearth it. Yet, the human drive to understand, to measure and to record is incredibly resilient. While the Aegean world forgot how to write, across the globe, that same intellectual fire was taking root in a vastly different environment. We must leave the ashes of the ruined Mediterranean ports. We travel now across the Atlantic Ocean, moving deep into the dense, humid canopies of Mesoamerica. Here, another brilliant civilization was rising toward an unprecedented peak of complexity. They did not merely use writing to count grain or track copper shipments. They built their entire society around the obsessive measurement of the cosmos. They mapped the stars, calculated the mathematics of deep time, and carved their legacy into towering limestone monuments. They were masters of their jungle world, and yet, despite their profound intellectual achievements, they too would eventually succumb to the quiet, relentless power of the environment they sought to control. While the Mediterranean world lost its written syllables to fire and silence, a different kind of obsession was taking root across the ocean. Deep within the Mesoamerican jungle canopy, a master sculptor stood before a towering block of pale limestone. He was carving a long-count calendar stela. This singular monument, quarried entirely by human muscle and shaped with hardened stone tools, stands over 30 feet tall and weighs more than 60 tons. Its surface is an intricately woven tapestry of glyphs, majestic profiles, and strict geometric proportions. Yet beneath the artistic flourish lies a rigid, uncompromising grid of data. It is a machine made of rock, designed to calculate the architecture of eternity. The Maya civilization did not just measure time, they weaponized their understanding of it. They developed a sophisticated base 20, or vigesimal numerical system, driven by three simple symbols: a shell representing 0, a dot representing 1, and a bar representing 5. They grasped the philosophical and mathematical concept of the void centuries before European scholars dared to conceptualize a placeholder for nothingness. With this elegant code, their astronomers tracked the erratic orbit of Venus with a margin of error measured in fractions of a day over hundreds of years. They calculated the exact length of the solar year to a degree of precision that modern instruments would only confirm a millennium later. This staggering intellectual accuracy extended far beyond the carved faces of their limestone calendars. Beneath the emerald ceiling of the rainforest, a sprawling network of interconnected metropolises pulsed with the energy of millions. Citizens traded and travelled along raised, gleaming white causeways known as Sakbiob, which sliced through the dense, unforgiving jungle in perfectly straight lines. These elevated limestone roads acted as both vital trade arteries and complex hydrological dams, managing the extreme seasonal rainfall of the tropics. The architecture of these cities was a direct physical manifestation of their mathematical genius. Step pyramids rose like artificial mountains above the tree line, their steep staircases perfectly aligned to capture the creeping shadows of solstices and equinoxes. Entire urban centres were laid out as earthly mirrors of the night sky, built to reflect the precise geometries of the constellations above. Priests standing atop these towering limestone summits could predict a solar eclipse generations before the moon ever dared to cross the sun. They operated under the profound belief that by calculating the cyclical rhythms of the universe, they could control the chaotic, unpredictable forces of the earth below. They had seemingly conquered the mathematics of human survival. Time was their ultimate medium, their most sacred currency. It was recorded obsessively on thousands of stone monuments across the continent, anchoring every royal birth, every political alliance, and every temple dedication to a continuous, unbreakable timeline. Their calculations stretched millions of years backward into a mythological past, and projected millions of years forward into an assured, highly structured future. And then, the dates simply run out. In the twilight of the 9th century, the obsessive rhythmic chipping of flint against limestone abruptly ceased. The master carvers dropped their tools, leaving half-finished glyphs staring blankly into the encroaching foliage. The undisputed lords of time vanished, abandoning their mathematical perfection to the crushing silent embrace of the jungle roots. The long-count calendar was designed to measure eternity. It tracked the movements of Venus, the solar year, and cycles spanning millions of days. Then, the counting stopped. For centuries, the rhythm of this civilization was defined by the relentless strike of stone on stone. Every political alliance, every royal birth, and every military victory was meticulously carved into towering limestone pillars. The historical record was loud, proud, and seemingly infinite. Deep in the dense limestone quarries of Guatemala, the evidence of a sudden rupture remains frozen in rock. Massive rectangular blocks lie half-carved, the intricate hieroglyphs abandoned mid-sentence. The sculptors simply dropped their tools. For a civilization fundamentally obsessed with predicting the future ceased to arrive. The grand cycle of time lost its scribes. Tomorrow was no longer written. It is vital to recognize that the Maya people did not vanish. Millions of their descendants still live, speak the ancient languages, and thrive across Mesoamerica today. It was the vast, heavy political machine that evaporated into the humid air. The divine kings, the stargazing priests, and the rigid hierarchy of the elite centers dissolved. The massive step pyramids and the long raised limestone causeways were suddenly devoid of ceremonial life. The rulers lost their mandate. Without the constant, organized labor required to hold back the encroaching forest, nature reclaimed its territory with terrifying speed. Seeds settled in the cracks of the vast sun-baked stucco courtyards. Roots of the giant ceiba trees shattered the astronomical observatories. During the 9th century, one by one, the great metropolitan hubs fell silent. The city of Copan erected its final monument in the year 822. The carving is noticeably unfinished, the royal figures left as rough, ghostly outlines in the stone. Tanina, another massive political centre, managed to hold on slightly longer. Its final long count date was carved in the year 909. After that, the historical record goes entirely dark. There is no final stela detailing a catastrophic defeat by a foreign empire. There is no desperately baked clay tablet begging for help, like the one we found at Ugarit across the world. There is only an abrupt architectural silence. Picture a master artisan striking a chisel against limestone, meticulously recording a king's divine lineage. The next strike never comes. The monument is left to be swallowed by the dark green shade of the mahogany trees. The people who farmed the maize outside the city centres likely watched the elite system collapse. The complex trade networks that brought jade and obsidian from distant mountains abruptly snapped. The societal contract was broken. The kings had claimed a divine ability to bring the rains and command the changing of the seasons. When they could no longer fulfill that fundamental promise, the population walked away from the heavy burden of supporting them. The elite centres became hollow stone shells. This was not a localised disaster, but a systemic hemorrhage across a vast, interconnected geographic area. The most complex political and economic network in the Americas ceased to function. The heart of the empire stopped beating. Vines wrapped around the stone altars of the rain gods. The thick canopy of the Mesoamerican jungle closed tightly over the white plaster walls, hiding them from the sun for centuries. The ultimate timekeepers were swallowed by the earth. A haunting anomaly emerges from these quiet, vine-strangled ruins. Why does a society perfectly engineered to track the infinite march of time suddenly stop recording it? High above the dense, unbroken green canopy of the Guatemalan jungle, a specialized aircraft sweeps back and forth in tight, methodical grids. It is mapping the forest floor using light detection and ranging, the same LIDAR technology we encountered earlier. Billions of rapid laser pulses pierce the tiny gaps in the foliage, bouncing off the hidden contours of the earth below. When computers strip away the digital noise of the trees, the resulting bare earth map defies a century of traditional archaeological assumptions. The jungle is not a wild, untamed wilderness that occasionally houses an isolated temple complex. Instead, the topographical data reveals a sprawling, continuous and hyperdense megalopolis. For decades, scholars walking the ground believed these city-states were relatively self-contained, separated by vast stretches of empty rainforest. The modern scans prove the exact opposite to be true. The spaces between the famous step pyramids are entirely choked with the foundational footprints of tens of thousands of ordinary homes. This was not a landscape where humans lived lightly or passively within nature. The Maya terraformed their environment on a scale rivaling modern industrial states, bending the earth to their absolute will. Entire hillsides were carved into aggressive, sweeping agricultural terraces to maximize the planting of maize and squash. Massive, artificial reservoirs were dug deep into the porous limestone bedrock. They were meticulously plastered to hoard millions of gallons of rainwater for the inevitable dry season. Complex drainage canals were engineered to divert destructive floodwaters away from vulnerable, low-lying crops. Connecting this vast, continuous urban sprawl were the raised limestone causeways, stretching for dozens of miles across the basin. These elevated highways did not just link royal courts for ceremonial processions. They functioned as the major bustling arteries of a highly integrated, trade-dependent civilization. The lasers also detected features that spoke to a darker, more desperate reality. Thousands of newly discovered defensive walls, ramparts, and watchtowers ringed these residential zones. The landscape was heavily fortified, suggesting a society fiercely protecting every available inch of cultivated earth. Because of this continuous sprawl, population estimates have been forced upward by a staggering, almost unbelievable degree. We are no longer looking at a scattered civilization of 1 or 2 million people. The data suggests that during the late Classic period, this specific region supported upwards of 10 to 15 million souls. It was a population density comparable to modern-day Los Angeles, yet entirely sustained by Stone Age agricultural technology. The sheer, physical weight of humanity pressing down on this fragile tropical ecosystem was immense. This introduces a terrifying, inflexible concept known as environmental carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the maximum population an environment can sustain indefinitely without irreversibly degrading its natural resources. The new maps reveal that the Maya had pushed this natural limit to its absolute breaking edge. The towering trees and deep forest shadows we see today simply did not exist. The land was stripped bare of timber, paved over with thick stucco, and engineered for relentless agricultural production. Every available square metre was aggressively managed just to extract enough daily calories to keep the civilization alive. To feed 10 million people in a seasonal tropical forest requires an incredibly delicate systemic balance. The rain must fall exactly when the mathematical calendar predicts, and the engineered reservoirs must fill to their precise brims. There is absolutely no margin for error and no safety net for a bad harvest. This hyper-dense megalopolis was a breathtaking marvel of human ingenuity, but it was fundamentally trapped by its own massive scale. The society had grown rigidly adapted to a highly specific, predictable climate pattern. They were entirely unaware that the sky above their cleared fields was about to fundamentally change. While lasers map the ghosts of cities from the sky, the definitive record of their ruin lies deep underground. Beneath the crushed limestone plasters of the Maya world, water slowly works its way through the dark. It drips from the ceilings of subterranean caves. Drop by drop, it builds stone. Here, we find our next physical anchor. A single, slow-growing stalagmite carefully harvested from the Yokbalum cave in southern Belize. To a paleoclimatologist, this jagged pillar is not just a rock. It is a vertical, high-definition timeline of the ancient sky. Every year, rainwater seeps through the jungle soil, carrying dissolved minerals into the cavern below. As a drop falls, it leaves a microscopic layer of calcite on the stalagmite. Within that calcite are distinct isotopes of oxygen. During wet years, lighter oxygen isotopes are flushed into the cave, but during a severe dry spell, those lighter isotopes evaporate at the surface, leaving a dense concentration of heavier oxygen-18 to drip into the dark. By slicing the stalagmite in half and using mass spectrometry to read these isotopic layers, scientists can reconstruct the exact amount of rainfall for any given year. The rock does not lie. It is a relentless, dripping metronome of climate history. And when researchers scanned the layers corresponding to the 9th century, the metronome stuttered. The stalagmite climate proxies reveal a terrifying anomaly. The seasonal rains did not just arrive late, they stopped entirely. This was not a standard, manageable dry season. It was a multi-decade mega-drought. The stalagmite layers show a sudden, catastrophic plunge in precipitation, beginning right around the year 820. This is the exact moment the final, half-finished monuments were carved at the city of Copan. The sudden silence of the historical record perfectly matches the sudden silence of the rain. Over the next century, the region was battered by a series of punishing, overlapping dry spells. It was the most severe climate shock the environment had endured in 2,000 years. The Maya were not ignorant of dry cycles. They had spent centuries deeply engineering their landscape to survive them. They plastered their vast urban plazas with thick stucco, deliberately angling the city surfaces to funnel every drop of monsoon runoff into massive artificial reservoirs. They built raised agricultural terraces and elaborate canal grids to maintain soil moisture during the dry months. They manipulated their local environment with total mathematical mastery. But this brilliant adaptation created a fatal vulnerability. These complex water systems allowed their cities to scale to an extreme size. They had pushed the environmental carrying capacity of the jungle to its absolute maximum limit. Millions of people now relied entirely on a highly optimized, intricately balanced artificial hydrology. When the rains failed year after year, that balance shattered. The massive urban reservoirs simply evaporated. The water lilies, a symbol of pure drinking water for the Maya elite, withered and died in the stagnant mud. The raised terraced hillsides baked into cracked dust. The very infrastructure that allowed their civilization to reach such staggering heights became an inescapable trap. You cannot water a densely packed population of 10 million people with empty stone basins. The systemic failure was absolute. A highly engineered society, perfectly adapted to its historical baseline, was suddenly crushed by an unprecedented shift in the global climate. The water stopped, and in the suffocating, thirsty cities above, the slow drip of desperation began to curdle into violence. The The stalagmites deep within the Yokbalum cave tell a silent story of atmospheric chemistry. On the surface, that chemistry translated into a slow, agonizing starvation. The massive artificial reservoirs, once the ultimate triumph of Maya engineering, turned into cracked, empty bowls of baked clay. The rains simply did not come. For the rulers of the late Classic period, this ecological failure was an immediate political catastrophe. Maya kings were not mere administrators or generals. They were divine intermediaries, living gods whose primary function was to maintain the delicate balance of the cosmos. Their public bloodletting rituals and precise astronomical observations were supposed to guarantee the seasonal rains. When the skies remained clear year after relentless year, the entire foundation of divine kingship began to fracture. A ruler who cannot summon the rain is a ruler who has lost the favour of the gods. The ideological legitimacy of the elite evaporated alongside the surface water. The ancient social contract was entirely broken. Populations that once laboured together to construct towering step pyramids now faced a stark, unforgiving reality. The environmental carrying capacity had been decisively breached. Millions of people were trapped in an engineered landscape that could no longer feed them. The response was a rapid descent into brutal endemic resource warfare. This was not the highly ritualized, elite-focused conflict of earlier centuries, which was often designed to capture rival lords for ceremonial sacrifice. This was a desperate, systemic struggle for raw survival. Neighbouring cities turned against one another in a frantic bid to secure the few remaining agricultural terraces and shrinking water supplies. The complex web of regional alliances dissolved into sheer chaos. Modern airborne laser scanning has laid bare the staggering panic of these final decades. The LiDAR topographical maps reveal a landscape suddenly scarred by hasty, frantic defensive fortifications. These were not the carefully planned, majestic walls of a secure, expanding empire. They were crude barricades built by terrified people running out of time. The physical evidence of this desperation is truly harrowing. In several major urban centres, archaeologists analysing the scans have detected defensive walls cutting directly across the ground. Once sacred plazas, the inhabitants were actively tearing down the carved facades of their own monumental architecture to build these barricades. The sacred heart of the city was physically dismantled. It was desecrated not by foreign conquerors, but by its own starving populace, desperate to keep their equally starving neighbours out. Trade networks completely disintegrated. The vital supply chains of obsidian, salt, and agricultural surplus vanished almost overnight. As one valley fell to violence and famine, frantic waves of refugees fled to the next. These sudden migrations overwhelmed the already strained infrastructure of neighbouring cities. It was a rapid, compounding domino effect of starvation, displacement, and defensive warfare. The violence was not a cultural failing, but the tragic, inevitable symptom of total ecological collapse. When the environmental baseline shifts beyond a society's ability to adapt, even the most deeply ingrained religious taboos dissolve under the crushing weight of mass starvation. Their profound mathematical genius offered no salvation. The vigesimal numerical system could calculate the exact solar year and track the complex orbit of Venus with staggering precision. Yet, all the astronomical knowledge in the world could not conjure a single drop of rain from a merciless empty sky. The brilliant minds of the Maya were entirely trapped by the limits of their geography. The grand civilization did not fall to a sudden unified invasion from an unknown empire. It violently consumed itself from within. The final, unfinished monuments at Copan and Tonina were carved in an era of extreme defensive paranoia and profound societal exhaustion. Long before the heavy jungle canopy reclaimed the white limestone, the great cities had already been silenced by their own catastrophic internal collapse. The defensive walls built across the sacred plazas eventually stopped holding back the inevitable. It was not an invading army that finally claimed the cities, but the creeping silence itself. The noise of tens of thousands of voices, the rhythmic striking of flint against limestone simply ceased. The great Maya observatories were instruments of absolute uncompromising precision. Their narrow stone windows were perfectly calibrated to catch the transit of Venus across the tropical sky. They measured the solar year to a fraction of a decimal point, carving the mathematics of time itself into heavy monuments. Yet, this mathematical perfection had no defense against the slow, relentless biology of the rainforest. A strangler fig does not care about the orbit of Venus or the sacred geometry of the cosmos. A single seed, dropped by a passing bird, finds an invisible crack in the damp mortar of a step pyramid. Over decades, its pale roots creep downward, desperately seeking moisture in the dry, porous limestone. The roots thicken, exerting an immense, silent hydraulic pressure against stones that took hundreds of men to cut and place. Slowly, inevitably, the precise astronomical alignments are pushed permanently off their axes. The sacred line of sight to the equinox sun is blocked by a massive twisting wooden trunk. Walls that once reflected the blinding white of the sun are stained deep green by spreading moss. The carefully engineered reservoir, once the supreme symbol of elite power, choke with dark sediment and decaying vegetation. Their artificial plastered bottoms crack under the roots, allowing the precious remaining water to bleed back into the earth. The jungle is a patient, methodical eraser of human ambition. It swallows the rigid geometry of the city and replaces it with the chaotic, overwhelming architecture of the canopy. There is a profound, melancholic tragedy in this slow devouring. The tragedy is not merely that the stones fell, but that an entire centre of human knowledge was fractured. The intricate mathematics, the complex written language, and the deep agricultural engineering were severed from the people who built them. The divine kings had fundamentally failed their most basic duty. When the water vanished, the ideology of the ruling class shattered completely. The people realized the massive monuments could not feed them. But to say the Maya mysteriously vanished is a profound misunderstanding of the historical record. The Maya people never left the deep forests or the coastal highlands. Millions of their descendants still live across the region today, speaking the complex languages of their ancestors. What disappeared was not a population, but a highly rigid, top-heavy political system. The classical hierarchy of divine kingship collapsed under the staggering weight of its own ecological debt. When the mega-droughts broke the agricultural carrying capacity, the common people made a rational choice. They simply walked away from the crumbling monuments. They abandoned the unsustainable massive urban centres that demanded endless tribute and endless water. Dispersing into smaller, more resilient farming communities, they survived by leaving the dead cities behind. Survival required abandoning the very system that had brought them to the brink of ruin. The people endured, while the palaces of the elite were surrendered to the roots and the rain. It is a stark reminder that human survival often depends on the willingness to let go of the structures we revere. The tropical forest reclaims its territory with a slow, devastating certainty. But the Maya were not the only civilization to fall into the trap of massive, rigid over-engineering in a changing climate. Half a world away, in the dense forests of Southeast Asia, another empire was rising. They were attempting to perfectly master the landscape through sheer scale. They sought to perfectly control the very element that would eventually rise up and break them. Break through the dense, sprawling canopy of the Cambodian jungle, and the chaotic tangle of vegetation suddenly yields to a terrifyingly perfect geometric shape. This is the West Baray. It is a man-made body of water so massive it dictates the local horizon, measuring roughly 8 kilometers long and over 2 kilometers wide. The Maya were devoured by the forest when their precarious limestone reservoirs ran dry, but halfway across the globe, another tropical empire attempted something far more audacious. They did not merely collect rainfall to survive the dry months. They attempted to physically domesticate the monsoon. Welcome to the Khmer Empire and to its sprawling epicenter at Angkor. From the 9th to the 15th century, this civilization stood as the undisputed titan of Southeast Asia. Modern observers often picture Angkor purely through the lens of its most famous monument, Angkor Wat, viewing it as a cluster of isolated stone temples built for divine worship. But this romanticized image fundamentally misunderstands the physical reality of the landscape. The towering stone temples were merely the spiritual nodes embedded within a colossal, living hydraulic machine. Angkor was not a traditional walled city, but a sprawling water metropolis, a low-density urban matrix that stretched across 1,000 square kilometers of the Mekong Basin. At its absolute zenith in the 12th century, it supported a population approaching 1 million people. To put that scale into perspective, London at the same time held perhaps 40,000 residents. Angkor was, by a staggering margin, the largest pre-industrial complex on the face of the earth. To sustain 1 million mouths in a landscape defined by violent seasonal whiplash, 6 months of torrential monsoon deluge followed by 6 months of bone-dry heat, the Khmer engineers had to entirely rewrite the regional geography. They moved millions of tons of earth entirely by hand. They constructed a rigid, unyielding grid of canals, embankments and spillways that imposed perfect right angles upon the natural curves of the floodplain. The centerpieces of this artificial geography were the berets, those massive rectangular reservoirs that dominated the skyline. Unlike modern reservoirs carved into valleys, the berets were built entirely above ground. The Khmer constructed massive earthen dikes, some standing 10 meters high, to trap the water above the surrounding elevation. This created a pressurized system driven entirely by gravity, a true masterpiece of fluid dynamics. When the torrential summer rains arrived, floodwaters threatening the city were seamlessly diverted through defensive trenches and channeled into these vast holding tanks. The surplus water was captured and tamed, held in suspense above the rice paddies. Then, when the dry season scorched the earth and the natural rivers shrank to a trickle, that stored water was slowly bled out. It flowed through a microscopic network of distribution canals, feeding endless terraced fields and sustaining 3 to 4 rice harvests a single year. This was a triumph of infrastructural scale, an artificial hydrosphere that allowed the Khmer rulers to bypass the natural limits of their environment. Every citizen lived on an elevated embankment, surrounded by the constant hum of this massive aquatic engine. However, anchoring a civilization to a single monolithic infrastructure creates a dangerous paradox. Extreme engineering locks a society into extreme vulnerability. Every temple, every wooden home, and every grain of rice was entirely dependent on the continuous, flawless operation of this sprawling water grid. The Khmer had built a machine of terrifying scale, one that required absolute control over nature to survive. The roaring arteries of the Khmer hydraulic machine did not fail overnight. The transition from absolute supremacy to desperate survival was a slow, agonizing suffocation. Over the span of decades, the rush of meticulously engineered water faded into a stagnant trickle. The scale of this silent fading is difficult to comprehend. At its zenith, Angkor supported a population of nearly 1 million people. It was the largest pre-industrial urban complex on the planet, dwarfing the cities of medieval Europe. It was a sprawling, interconnected metropolis spanning over 1,000 square kilometers. The city was a living, breathing organism heavily dependent on the constant flow of water through its veins. When that circulation faltered, the city did not explode, it simply began to wither. There is no catastrophic destruction layer buried in the sediment here. Archaeologists find no evidence of a sudden fiery siege that leveled the capital, nor mass graves of a slaughtered populace. The end of this metropolis was eerily, painfully quiet. Instead, the physical record shows a gradual, exhausted retreat. Massive distribution canals, once dredged by armies of labourers, choked with thick monsoon silt. When the channels blocked, they were simply left unrepaired, the mud hardening like concrete in the dry season. Stone spillways cracked under shifting pressures. Their immense sandstone blocks tumbled into the stagnant water below. They lay there, ignored by a population that was already packing up its wooden homes and walking away from the capital. The great religious monuments were left perfectly intact. Vast stone temples, constructed to mirror the perfection of the cosmos, stood empty in the humid air. Without the constant daily labour of thousands to keep the relentless jungle at bay, the forest simply stepped back into the city. Strangler figs and towering silk cotton trees dropped their seeds into the crumbling reservoirs. Roots crawled over the intricate bas-reliefs of celestial dances and ancient battle scenes. Nature began a slow, deliberate erasure of human hubris. Troops of wild macaques claimed the vast empty courtyards and terrace steps. Their sharp shrieks echoed through the vaulted stone galleries, replacing the deep resonance of temple gongs and the hum of 1 million voices. The largest city on earth was handed over to the shadows of the canopy. This presents historians with a profound, unsettling paradox. The Khmer Empire was a civilization that entirely mastered the flow of water. They built their empire in a region defined by the immense reliable rains of the seasonal monsoon. They did not live in a fragile, marginal desert environment, nor on a freezing, isolated frontier. They lived in an environment practically overflowing with life and moisture. They possessed the most sophisticated hydroengineering grid the ancient world had ever seen. Their entire political hierarchy and religious identity were inextricably tied to the control of rainfall and the distribution of life-giving water. Their divine kings ruled precisely because they commanded the monsoons. Yet, they ultimately abandoned their monumental masterpiece. The empty berets and ruined canals leave us with a chilling forensic puzzle. The answer lies hidden in the microscopic rings of ancient trees and the fossilized mud of the reservoirs. We must ask how the ultimate water machine breaks. To solve the riddle of an empty metropolis, modern science must look away from the stone temples. The answer lies hundreds of miles east, hidden inside the living wood of the Vietnamese highlands. High in these mist-shrouded mountains, ancient cypress trees stand as silent, undisturbed witnesses to the sky. A cross-section of a 1,000-year-old trunk is not just timber. It is a biological hard drive, perfectly preserving the climatic history of Southeast Asia. Climatologists extract thin core samples from these ancient cypresses to perform dendrochronology, the precise science of translating tree rings into a vast regional weather map. The mechanism of this biological archive is beautifully simple. In years of steady, heavy rain, the tree grows rapidly, leaving a wide, pale ring of new wood. In years of severe drought, the tree restricts its growth to survive, leaving only a dark, tightly compressed band. By counting backward from the bark, researchers can read the rainfall of any specific year in history. When they examined the rings corresponding to the 13th and 14th centuries, the data aligned perfectly with the silence of Angkor. But the wood did not reveal a simple story of a slowly drying world. The rings revealed violence. They showed an era of extreme, unpredictable climate whiplash. First came the tightening. Decades of painfully thin, dark rings indicate a crippling mega-drought that settled over the entire Mekong basin. The regular, life-giving summer monsoons, which had watered the empire for centuries, simply failed to arrive. The soil baked. The rivers slowed to a crawl. The skies remained stubbornly, terrifyingly clear year after year. Then came the deluge. Just as the parched earth cracked open and the society was pushed to the brink of starvation, the climate snapped back with unprecedented fury. The narrow bands in the cypress wood are suddenly interrupted by massive explosive growth rings. These thick, pale bands translate to catastrophic mega-monsoons. Torrents of water battered the landscape, dropping unimaginable volumes of rain onto ground that was too dry to absorb it. The sky dumped years' worth of suppressed moisture into a matter of weeks, tearing through the jungle canopy. The whiplash did not end there. After the devastating floods, the rains vanished entirely once again, plunging the region straight back into another multi-decade drought. The climate oscillated wildly, swinging like a broken pendulum between extreme starvation and extreme drowning. This was a profound destabilization of the global climate system. The predictable, rhythmic breathing of the Asian monsoon, the very heartbeat of the Khmer agricultural calendar, had devolved into a chaotic, erratic spasm. This kind of shifting baseline is the most dangerous scenario for a complex society. Human beings can adapt to a permanently dry climate, and they can engineer survival in a permanently wet one. But no civilization can adapt to rapid, extreme oscillation. The sheer unpredictability of the shifting climate system paralyzes all long-term survival strategies. A farmer cannot plant seeds for a flood when the soil is turning to dust. A king cannot stockpile grain for a drought when the storehouses are being washed away in a torrent of mud. Now project this erratic, violent weather onto the massive artificial hydrosphere of Angkor. The vast reservoirs, the precise canals, the intricate spillways, they were all engineered for a predictable, steady flow of water. They were monuments to a stable climate that simply no longer existed. Water was no longer a mathematically manageable resource. It had become a chaotic, destructive force, and a rigidly engineered grid of sandstone and laterite cannot bend when the sky finally decides to break. The climate whiplash recorded in the Vietnamese cypress rings did not merely starve the Khmer Empire, it physically battered the artificial hydrosphere of Angkor into pieces. The transition from decades of severe drought to sudden, unprecedented monsoon deluges turned their greatest engineering triumph into an inescapable weapon. During the prolonged dry periods, the massive water grid simply ground to a halt. The vast berets, designed to hold inland oceans of monsoon rain, became shallow, stagnant pools baking in the heat. Without the constant, forceful flow of water to flush the system, the intricate network of canals began to choke on accumulating silt and blowing sand. Thousands of miles of carefully engineered earthworks dried out and cracked under the relentless sun. The packed clay linings that held the water in place became brittle, losing their structural integrity. The massive hydraulic machine, which required continuous pressure and daily maintenance to function, lost its momentum and began to seize. Then the mega monsoons arrived with apocalyptic suddenness. The cracked, weakened canals were instantly overwhelmed by rushing torrents of water they were never designed to channel. Massive stone spillways, which had safely regulated the flow for centuries, were violently torn apart by the sheer hydrostatic pressure. Huge earthen dams, baked into dry dust for years, dissolved back into heavy mud and collapsed under the weight of the floodwaters. Intricately carved stone bridges were undermined by the surging currents and swept away, severing vital arteries of transport across the sprawling metropolis. The water, once tamed and meticulously guided, became a chaotic, destructive force tearing through the agricultural heart of the capital. The Khmer engineers found themselves completely trapped by the immense scale of their own creation. Over centuries of expansion, they had terraformed the Mekong Basin landscape so entirely that there was no natural drainage left to absorb the environmental shock. They had achieved a state of absolute infrastructural lock-in. Every new canal and every expanded reservoir had required progressively more labour to maintain. The system had grown far too massive, and its stonework too rigid, to adapt quickly to violent climate swings. When the primary spillways shattered under the floodwaters, the physical layout of the city prevented them from being easily redesigned or relocated. A population of 1 million people relied entirely on this single, rigid machine functioning with absolute perfection. There was no secondary system, no redundancy built for a climate that suddenly swung wildly between extremes. The monumental scale of Angkor, which had guaranteed its regional dominance for generations, now guaranteed its total collapse. The destruction was grinding and mechanical. Earthworks failed in cascading sequences. Canals breached their banks, burying the carefully levelled rice paddies under thick layers of sterile sand during the floods, only to leave them baking into impenetrable hardpan when the droughts returned. Modern excavations have uncovered the desperate, frantic repair efforts undertaken by the failing empire. Giant blocks of heavy laterite stone were hastily ripped from sacred temples and dragged across the city to patch the collapsing dams. But these were merely localized bandages applied to a massive systemic hemorrhage. The hydraulic machine was fundamentally tearing itself apart under the stress of the changing sky. The water grid had become an unmanageable physical burden, demanding far more manual labour than a starving, exhausted population could possibly provide. The infrastructure had completely calcified, turning the magnificent capital into a sprawling trap of fractured stone and suffocating mud. Human engineering had pushed the natural carrying capacity of the jungle to its absolute breaking point. But planetary shifts do not negotiate with human architecture, no matter how grand or mathematically precise. The artificial hydrosphere of Angkor did not just gently fail, it actively consumed the society that built it. Consider a simple, unglazed clay alms bowl from the 14th century, resting near the base of a towering unfinished stone temple. This modest object represents the explicit limit of the climate collapse theory at Angkor. Extreme weather broke the stone, but human choices left it broken. The mega-monsoons and subsequent mega-droughts undoubtedly shattered the vast hydraulic machine of the Khmer Empire. Yet environmental determinism alone rarely accounts for the complete abandonment of a thriving capital. A society with absolute collective will can rebuild broken canals, just as they originally carved them from the earth. But the Khmer state had lost its fundamental mechanism for mobilizing mass human labor. The spiritual contract between the rulers and the ruled had been quietly rewritten. The physical brokenness of the water grid was fatal only because the social system had already fragmented. For centuries the empire was driven by the concept of the God King, a divine ruler who served as the living bridge between heaven and earth. This absolute religious status allowed monarchs to command tens of thousands of workers. These vast corvée labour forces were essential to constantly dredge canals and repair the massive embankments of the Beres. However, by the 13th and 14th centuries, a profound socio-religious shift swept through the Mekong Basin. Theravada Buddhism arrived from Sri Lanka, carried not by conquering armies, but by wandering monks holding simple clay bowls. It spread rapidly among the common people, offering a radically different worldview. This new doctrine was deeply egalitarian, teaching that spiritual merit was achieved through personal action and monastic discipline. Enlightenment was no longer tied to the worship of divine monarchs or the construction of colossal stone monuments. The god-kings were suddenly reduced to mere mortals in the eyes of their subjects. This ideological revolution dismantled the coercive labour dynamics that kept the artificial hydrosphere alive. When the climate whiplash tore through the laterite spillways and choked the central canals with dense sediment, the central authority faltered. They could no longer summon the legions of peasants required to dig the city out of the mud. The systemic rigidity of the stone infrastructure was now fatally matched by a collapse in state authority. Compounding this internal religious fragmentation was an undeniable external pull, visible in the archaeological record through fragments of blue and white Ming dynasty porcelain. These specific ceramic shards are rarely found within the deep interior ruins of Angkor. Instead, they are clustered heavily to the south, near the modern capital of Phnom Penh, marking a decisive shift in global economics. A new era of trade was quietly making the inland capital obsolete. As the Chinese Empire rapidly expanded its maritime trade networks during the 14th and 15th centuries, the wealth of Southeast Asia flowed toward the coastal ports. The landlocked agricultural wealth of Angkor, entirely dependent on a failing water grid, was no longer the primary source of regional power. The economic centre of gravity had moved permanently. The Khmer elites faced a cold, pragmatic calculation. Repairing a hopelessly broken, sprawling hydraulic system required unimaginable resources and a labour force that no longer believed in their divinity. Moving south to the river junctions and the sea offered immediate integration into a booming global maritime economy. The collapse of Angkor was therefore not an overnight apocalypse, but a slow, compounding systemic failure. Extreme climate variability provided the fatal physical blow to the infrastructure, acting as the primary catalyst. But the society had already begun to outgrow the rigid system that built the city. Environmental destruction intersected perfectly with religious transformation and economic opportunism. The capital was not so much evacuated in a panic as it was gradually, methodically uninstalled over generations. The royal court eventually relocated to the south, chasing the maritime wealth, leaving the vast, intricate network of reservoirs and temples behind. The great city simply ceased to be the centre of the world, its stone arteries dry, quietly preparing to surrender its geometric perfection to the encroaching forest. Deep within the stifling shade of the Cambodian canopy, the massive stone faces of the Bayon Temple stare out into an encroaching ocean of green. Hundreds of colossal, serene visages are carved into the laterite stone towers. They smile with an unchanging godlike expression, seemingly oblivious to the thick, muscular roots of the strangler figs that now bind their foreheads. These are the faces of a civilization that believed it had permanently conquered the earth. The Khmer Empire did not merely build their capital upon the landscape of the Mekong Basin. They fundamentally rewrote the landscape itself. They transformed a chaotic, monsoon-drenched floodplain into a mathematically perfect artificial hydrosphere. It was the ultimate triumph of human engineering, a sprawling grid of reservoirs and canals that sustained 1 million lives. Yet this very triumph became the architecture of their doom. The hubris of infrastructure lies in the fatal assumption that tomorrow will always look exactly like today. The massive barrays of Angkor were perfectly calibrated for a specific, predictable rhythm of wet and dry seasons. They were a rigid, unyielding solution to a highly fluid problem. When the climate whiplash arrived, shifting violently between unprecedented mega-monsoons and crippling mega-droughts, the machine could not adapt. The systemic rigidity of their water grid locked them into a slow, inescapable collapse. It is a deeply humbling realization to stand among these ruins today. The greatest hydraulic engine of the ancient world was ultimately torn apart by the very rain it sought to master. Decades of relentless deluge overwhelmed the ancient spillways. The rushing water tore massive, unrepairable gouges through the earth, destroying the delicate network of distribution channels. These violent floods were immediately followed by decades of blistering heat. The sprawling ocean-like reservoirs were reduced to cracked, barren fields of dust. The water lilies, the sacred symbols of elite power, withered in the stagnant, shallow mud. The massive corvée labour forces, exhausted and starving, could no longer maintain the crumbling stone embankments. There was no sudden massacre here, no fiery destruction layer for archaeologists to unearth centuries later. There was only the quiet, tragic realization that the god kings had lost their absolute command over the sky. One by one, 1 million people simply walked away from the centre of the world. They left their magnificent step pyramids and sprawling highways to the wild macaques and the creeping jungle vines. Nature is deeply, terrifyingly patient. It does not need to wage a violent war against human ambition. It only needs to change the fundamental rules of the climate and wait. Over the centuries, the towering silk cotton trees slowly swallowed the sandstone temples. Their immense hydraulic roots pried apart the heavy blocks with a quiet, devastating pressure. Angkor stands today as a majestic, melancholic monument to the absolute limits of human control. It whispers a haunting warning across the centuries about the fragility of complex, over-engineered societies. We build our own vast, interconnected systems today, pouring concrete and laying steel, assuming the Earth will remain static beneath them. But the Earth is never truly static. The Khmer fought a desperate, generations-long war against the chaotic forces of water, and water eventually reclaimed its territory. But not all ancient societies chose to fight nature to the bitter end. Some recognized the shifting rhythms of the planet and simply surrendered to them. To understand this quieter, more peaceful kind of vanishing, we must leave the dense, suffocating jungles of Southeast Asia. We must travel westward, toward the sun-baked, arid plains of the Indian subcontinent. Here, another vast urban empire once thrived beside a great, life-giving river system. But when the water decided to move, they did not build endless stone walls to force it back. They simply let the river go. And then, without a sound, they faded away into the dust. The monumental stone faces of Angkor were carved to project divine power across a fractured jungle. Their over-engineered reservoirs were aggressive declarations of dominance over the chaotic monsoon. But if we leave the humid basin of the Mekong and travel westward to the arid plains of the Indian subcontinent, the architecture of power changes entirely. Consider a single baked mud brick, resting heavily in the palm of your hand. It is completely unadorned, devoid of royal seals or divine inscriptions. Yet, its dimensions reveal a staggering level of civilizational discipline. It measures exactly 7 centimeters high, 14 centimeters wide, and 28 centimeters long. This perfect mathematical ratio of 1 to 2 to 4 is not a local anomaly. It is an absolute, uncompromising standard. You will find this exact standardized brick used in construction sites separated by over 1,000 kilometers. Millions of them form the silent foundation of the Indus Valley civilization, thriving during the 3rd millennium before Christ. It was an empire spanning an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Unlike the chaotic, organic sprawl of early Bronze Age cities, urban centers like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were masterworks of grid planning. Their main streets were laid out in perfect alignment with the cardinal directions. The winds sweeping across the plains were deliberately channeled down these thoroughfares, acting as a natural air conditioning system. But the true marvel of the Indus Valley was hidden beneath the baked clay streets. They built the ancient world's most sophisticated systems of indoor plumbing and wastewater management. Nearly every private home featured a dedicated bathing room, and a flush toilet connected to a covered municipal drainage network. The grandest structure in Mohenjo-Daro was not a temple to a sun god or a fortress for a warlord. It was a massive public pool sealed with natural tar known today simply as the Great Bath. This civic obsession with cleanliness and order permeated their everyday lives. Archaeologists excavating these neighborhoods do not find caches of bronze swords or heavy armor. Instead, they unearth standardized stone weights for fair market trading and delicate terracotta toys. Picture a small, perfectly modelled clay cart drawn by 2 little ceramic oxen, designed solely to bring joy to a child. These are the artifacts of a society that prioritized domestic stability and regulated commerce over military conquest. There are no murals here depicting rulers trampling bound enemies. There are no monumental statues of god kings demanding tribute from a terrified populace. There are no royal tombs filled with slaughtered retainers meant to accompany a tyrant into the afterlife. The Indus Valley presents us with an incredibly rare archaeological footprint. It was a highly complex, prosperous and literate society that seemingly existed without a centralized coercive military force. Their authority was not enforced by the blade of a bronze spear. It was maintained through the quiet, unbreakable consensus of the standardized brick. For over 700 years, this balanced urban mechanism hummed along the banks of the mighty river systems. They traded with the distant cities of Sumer, exchanging etched carnelian beads for copper. Yet, despite their vast wealth, they never built monuments to their own ego. They engineered a society of profound, peaceful equilibrium, trusting that the predictable flooding of the rivers would sustain their perfect grid forever. But as history has repeatedly demonstrated, even the most orderly society remains completely subordinate to the restless earth. The rivers that fed their perfectly aligned streets were bound to the shifting tectonic plates beneath the Himalayas, and a silent, devastating change was already gathering deep beneath the soil. History conditions us to expect violence at the end of an era. We look for the thick black ash layer that marks the late Bronze Age collapse in the Mediterranean. We search for the defensive fortifications hastily erected in the sacred plazas of the Maya, or the desperate final messages baked into clay tablets like those found at Ugarit. We dig for the shattered bones, the discarded arrowheads, and the scorched earth. But in the ruins of the Indus Valley civilization, the soil holds no such trauma. The earth here is profoundly, stubbornly quiet. When modern excavators first peeled back the layers of dust covering Mohenjo-Daro, they braced themselves for the familiar markers of ancient slaughter. Instead, they found an eerie, peaceful emptiness. Among the millions of artifacts recovered from these vast, perfectly aligned urban grids, weapons are almost entirely absent. Archaeologists have catalogued a handful of simple copper blades and rudimentary spears, but these are thin and fragile. They are tools far better suited for hunting game or cutting brush than for human conflict. There is no armour, there are no shields, there are no arsenals of bronze swords waiting to be unearthed. This absence extends to the very structure of their society. There are no royal palaces sacked and burned by rival kings. There are no monuments to egomaniacal warlords. Think of the Egyptian royal propaganda at Medinet Habu, boasting of slaughtered enemies, or the Maya stele detailing the capture and sacrifice of rival lords. The Indus people left behind thousands of beautifully carved soapstone seals, yet their iconography is completely devoid of conquest. There are no images of bound captives. There are no warrior kings driving chariots over the vanquished. A civilization spanning roughly 1 million square kilometres seems to have existed for centuries without a standing army, without a police force, and without the institutionalised violence we assume is necessary to govern a massive population. When their end came, it was not a sudden, violent catastrophe. It was a slow, agonising softening of their pristine urban order. The physical evidence paints a picture of gradual, heartbreaking decay. The standardised baked mud bricks, once manufactured to that perfect 1:2:4 ratio, were no longer produced in massive uniform batches. Instead, the descendants of the original builders began to scavenge the older neighbourhoods. They ripped bricks from abandoned homes to patch their own, building increasingly shoddy, crooked walls that ignored the ancient sacred grid. The brilliant indoor plumbing and wastewater management systems slowly choked to death. For hundreds of years, strict civic oversight had kept the covered drains clear, sweeping the wastewater away from the clean residential blocks. But as the civilization faded, the maintenance simply stopped. The deep brick channels began to fill with heavy silt and street debris. Pale clay and foul water backed up into the pristine courtyards. The Great Bath, once the watertight jewel of the city, cracked and lay dry, its bitumen sealant peeling away under the harsh sun. The physical layout of the city physically contracted. Wide, windswept avenues were encroached upon as people built makeshift kilns and ovens directly in the middle of former thoroughfares. The strict separation of industrial pollution and domestic life completely dissolved. It is as if the collective memory of how to operate a metropolis simply evaporated into the arid air. Yet, even in this prolonged twilight, there is no evidence of panic. There are no skeletal remains scattered in the alleyways, striking down the myth of a sudden massacre by outside invaders. The people of the Indus Valley did not die screaming in the dark. They packed up their belongings in slow, methodical waves. They took their standard stone weights, their delicate jewellery, and their children's terracotta toy carts. They turned their backs on the failing drains and the crumbling brick walls, and they migrated outward, leaving their urban masterpieces to the drifting sands. It is a peaceful, orderly abandonment, utterly baffling to the modern mind. How does a complex, highly regulated society of such immense scale simply dismantle itself, surrender its cities, and quietly walk away? The makeshift kilns scattered across the thoroughfares of Mohenjo-daro were not the frantic remnants of a besieged people. They were the practical adaptations of a society slowly watching its lifeblood evaporate. To understand this quiet fading, we must look far beyond the baked mud bricks. We must pull back, rising high above the arid plains of the Indian subcontinent. From the cold, objective vantage point of space, satellite imagery reveals a geography completely invisible from the ground. Beneath the vast, shifting dunes of the modern Thar Desert lies a massive geological ghost. Advanced synthetic aperture radar, capable of piercing the dry surface sands, traces the deep, wide scars of an ancient watercourse. This is the paleo channel of the Ghaggar-Hakra river system. Thousands of years ago, it was a roaring perennial artery that ran parallel to the Indus. The Ghaggar-Hakra was the true anchor of this civilization. The vast majority of their meticulously planned settlements were actually strung along its banks, rather than the main Indus River itself. But the Earth is a restless engine, and its physical rhythms operate on a scale that ignores human architecture. Deep beneath the towering peaks of the Himalayas, tectonic plates continued their slow, grinding collision. This immense, invisible geological pressure subtly altered the gradient of the plains below. The subtle tilting of the Earth's crust began to capture the glacial runoff that once fed the Ghaggar-Hakra. Tributary streams were slowly diverted, captured by neighbouring river systems. The glacial water was siphoned away toward the Ganges basin to the east. Yet this tectonic lethargy was only half of the environmental equation. The sky, too, was quietly betraying them. Modern climatologists have drilled deep into the beds of high-altitude lakes and ancient cave stalagmites across the region. They extracted pristine cores of sediment and stone to perform precise oxygen isotope analysis. These microscopic chemical signatures act as a fossilized ledger of ancient rainfall. By measuring the ratio of heavy to light oxygen isotopes, scientists can reconstruct the exact strength of seasonal weather patterns. The data reveals a profound, long-term shift in the global climate system. Around 4,200 years ago, the seasonal engine of the summer monsoon began to falter. The monsoon winds, which had reliably drenched the subcontinent for millennia, grew fundamentally weaker. They began an agonizingly slow migration eastward. Year after year, the rains arrived a little later, fell a little lighter, and ended just a bit sooner. There was no single catastrophic drought to unite against. There was no sudden apocalyptic day when the rivers simply stopped flowing. Instead, it was a multi-generational geographic shift, a slow and silent strangulation of the landscape. A grandfather might tell stories of a river that flowed year-round, deep enough for heavy trade boats. His grandson would only know a seasonal stream that shrank to a muddy trickle during the dry months. Eventually, that stream became nothing more than a string of stagnant pools baking in the summer sun. The masterful indoor plumbing and wastewater management systems of the Indus cities became useless without a steady flow of fresh water. The great public baths sat dry, accumulating only windblown silt. The highly standardized agriculture that fed millions could no longer be sustained on the drying plains. This was not a violent collapse, but a systemic unspooling of an artificial human ecosystem. The environment simply changed the fundamental rules of survival. The carrying capacity of the land plummeted, and the massive urban grids could no longer support their dense populations. The response of the Indus Valley people was not panic, but a profound collective pragmatism. They did not build massive defensive walls or wage desperate resource wars. They simply packed their standardized weights, their clay toys, and their bronze tools, and began to walk. Over the course of 2 centuries, the population slowly migrated eastward and southward. They followed the retreating monsoon rains toward the greener Ganges basin. They deliberately de-urbanized, breaking apart the great metropolis into smaller, sustainable farming villages. The grand, peaceful cities were simply left behind, surrendered to the wind and the advancing desert sands. Picture the final days of Mohenjo-daro, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a long, quiet exhale. The Ghaggar-Hakra river system has shifted too far, and the wells have finally run dry. The families living in the meticulously planned grid of baked mud bricks make a rational, inevitable choice. They do not riot, and they do not starve behind decaying walls. They simply begin to pack. They gather their unglazed pottery, their bronze tools, and the small terracotta toy carts that once rolled down the paved thoroughfares. They walk out of the city gates, leaving the great bath empty and the silt-choked drainage systems to the advancing desert. There is no invading army chasing them into the horizon. There are no destruction layers of ash left behind in the archaeological record. They walk eastward, following the rains toward the Ganges basin. This is the reality of deurbanization, a phenomenon rarely captured with such peaceful clarity. The Indus Valley civilization did not collapse in a spectacular fire. It consciously dismantled its own complexity. The massive population dispersed into the surrounding landscape. They fractured into smaller, decentralized rural farming communities, trading the dense urban core for the organic, seasonal rhythms of village life. They adapted to the erratic summer monsoons by spreading out, ensuring that a localized drought could no longer cripple an entire metropolis. In many ways, this was a profoundly successful survival strategy. They did not stubbornly cling to an infrastructure that the climate could no longer support, unlike the builders of Angkor or the Maya kings. They gracefully accepted the limits of their environment, choosing life over the preservation of their monuments. Yet, this peaceful adaptation demanded a heavy, invisible toll. As the sprawling trade networks dissolved, the vast urban administration that managed them became entirely unnecessary. The standardized stone weights, once perfectly calibrated to maintain fairness in a bustling market, were left behind in the dust. The most heartbreaking casualty of this deurbanization was their voice. For centuries, merchants and officials had pressed intricately carved soapstone seals into clay, marking shipments with a beautiful, complex script. But a village farmer does not need a written language to track the harvest or feed his family. Without the immense logistical machine of the city to sustain it, the script lost its function. It was not outlawed by a conquering king, nor was it burned in a great library fire. It simply ceased to be useful, and the elders stopped teaching the symbols to the children. Within a few generations, the meaning of the characters evaporated entirely. Today, that script remains completely undeciphered. We can hold their physical artifacts, we can trace the precise 1:2:4 ratio of their bricks, but we cannot read their names. We cannot hear their prayers, their songs, or their final thoughts as they left their homes forever. There is a profound, lingering melancholy in the silence of the Indus Valley. A society that had mastered sanitation, built vast unfortified cities, and managed to live without institutionalized violence gracefully bowed out to nature. They did not build giant monuments to their own glory, and so history easily forgot them. The meticulous brick walls slowly crumbled beneath the weight of time, returning to the clay from which they were shaped. The wind swept across the dry riverbeds, burying the empty streets under the sands of the Thar Desert. Nature reclaimed the space without a fight, gently folding the greatest peaceful empire of the ancient world back into the earth. Their story stands as a humbling mirror to our own time. We build our towering skylines, we lay our concrete grids, and we convince ourselves that our written records will echo into eternity. We believe that complexity is a permanent state of human evolution, but the silent, empty streets of Mohenjo-Daro whisper a different truth. Even the most harmonious, deeply engineered societies are merely temporary arrangements with the planet. When the water moves, the cities must fall quiet. As the dust settles over the ancient world, we are left to look at our own modern landscape, wondering which of our great achievements will one day be nothing more than an undeciphered mystery in the sand. The migrating families of the Indus Valley carried their children away from the dry riverbeds. They left the standardized baked mud brick of Mohenjo-Daro to the blowing sands of the Thar Desert. They did not know they were participating in a much larger rhythm. It was a vast planetary exhalation. Step back from the arid plains of the Indian subcontinent. Pull your perspective high above the earth, watching the centuries flicker past like shadows on a sundial. The pattern reveals itself across the continents. It is a terrifying, beautiful symmetry. The Greenland Norse froze beside their empty harbours, waiting for ivory ships that never came. The kingdom of Tambora was erased in a single night of fire and compacted pumice. The rulers of Cahokia watched their stripped topsoil wash into the rivers, powerless to stop the floods, The cycle is absolute. Across the Mediterranean, the kings of the Late Bronze Age saw their interconnected world burn from drought and desperate migrations. The Maya starved beneath the shadow of their own mathematical perfection. The Khmer engineers broke their magnificent empire trying to cage the monsoon rain. All of them believed their walls would stand forever. There is a single, undeniable thread woven through these silent ruins. It is the illusion of permanence. Every peak society believes it is the final, unbreakable iteration of human progress. The truth is far more humbling. We look at our own sprawling cities of steel and glass, towering over the shorelines. We marvel at our global supply chains and our vast artificial hydrospheres. We assume we have finally conquered the ancient vulnerabilities. But we are built upon the exact same earth, breathing the exact same atmosphere. Systemic rigidity is the silent killer of empires. The more complex the machine becomes, the fewer parts need to fail for the entire engine to seize. We are not exempt from the laws of environmental carrying capacity. We are simply operating at a much larger scale. A shift in the rains, a prolonged drought, or a sudden winter can still test the limits of our engineering. The ancient world is not a distant mirror. It is a direct warning, written in abandoned timbers and unglazed clay bowls. Yet, there is a strange, profound comfort in this deep time perspective. The ruins of these great societies are not merely failures. They are monuments to human endurance, to the breathtaking audacity of trying to build order in a chaotic universe. They tried, beautifully. The earth simply reclaims what it is owed. The strangler fig roots slowly crush the carved limestone. The pale, sterile clay bands settle quietly over the grand plazas. The ice advances and the rivers change their course. It is a quiet, inevitable tide. Nature does not harbour malice toward the cities it consumes. It only seeks equilibrium. Let the weight of these centuries begin to settle. As the night deepens around you, release the tension of the modern world. The complex systems of our own time will still be there tomorrow. Tonight, you do not need to sustain them. Picture the empty cyclopean walls of Mycenae, resting calmly beneath the stars. Imagine the silent step pyramids, wrapped safely in the cool embrace of the jungle canopy. The struggle is over. The stones are at peace. The history of the world is a long, slow breathing. Civilizations rise like a deep inhalation, full of energy and purpose, and then, eventually, they exhale. The rivers shift, the rains move, and the people quietly walk away. There is nothing left to solve tonight. The mysteries have been returned to the earth, buried beneath the ash and the soil. The long count of the calendar has paused. Allow your own breathing to match the slow, hypnotic rhythm of the ancient world. Drift into the quiet, welcoming dark. Rest now in the stillness of the ruins.